There was a time, not so long ago in the life of our species, when the day did not begin with food. It began with light. The sun rose over grasslands, over river valleys, over the edges of forests. And the first question of the morning was not what to eat, but whether there was anything to find. For most of the 200,000 years that humans have walked the earth, the meal was not a certainty, it was a possibility. And the body you carry right now, the one settling into stillness as you listen, was shaped entirely inside that uncertainty. We live today in a world where food arrives with the clock. Breakfast at a certain hour, lunch at another, dinner at the end of the working day. The refrigerator hums in the kitchen. The shelves are full. The expectation of eating, not just today but tomorrow and the day after, is so deeply woven into daily life that we rarely pause to notice it. But for the overwhelming majority of human history, that expectation did not exist. The body learned to survive without it, and in many quiet ways, it still carries that learning inside it tonight. This is a story about hunger, not hunger as discomfort to be quickly solved, hunger as it actually was, a signal, a rhythm, a companion in the long walk of early human life. It is a story about how the ancient body managed the space between meals that sometimes stretched into days. It is a story about the metabolic wisdom built into your bones and your blood over hundreds of thousands of years, long before agriculture made dinner predictable. And it is a story told slowly, in the dark, at a pace that asks nothing urgent of you. Because the best way to understand deep time is to enter it gently, the way sleep enters you now. Let us begin at the beginning, which is to say, far back, further back than the first city, further back than the first farm, further back than the first written word. We begin in the landscapes of early Africa, where the human story started, in the middle of the Pleistocene epoch. This was a world of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary uncertainty. Grasslands stretched toward wide horizons, forests gave way to open plains, rivers rose in the wet season and shrank in the dry, and small groups of humans moved through all of it, reading the land for signs of what it might offer. These groups were not wandering aimlessly. They moved with intelligence and purpose, following seasonal patterns they had learned across generations. The direction the herds tended to travel in autumn, the places where certain roots could be dug after rain, the rivers where fish gathered in the months when the water ran clear and cold. Their knowledge of the landscape was intimate and precise, the kind of knowledge that accumulates over centuries of careful attention. But knowledge, no matter how precise, cannot guarantee the outcome of a hunt. It cannot make a fruit ripen before its season. It cannot call the rain back before the roots have dried. And so the people waited, and moved, and searched. And sometimes they found what they were looking for, and the group ate well. A large animal brought down on the open plain, the meat divided among the gathered hands, the marrow cracked from the long bones, the organs consumed first because they were richest, the meal going on late into the night while the fire burned low. And sometimes the search returned nothing, and the morning came without eating, and the group moved again toward the next possibility, their bodies adjusting quietly to the absence without collapse. This is the detail that changes everything when you sit with it long enough. The bodies of those early humans did not panic when a meal did not arrive. They did not shut down or fail or send their owners into crisis. They adjusted. Hormones shifted. The liver released stored energy. The metabolism turned its attention toward fat reserves. Alertness, in many cases, sharpened rather than dimmed, because a body that cannot think clearly when hungry is a body that cannot find the next meal. And that is a body that does not survive long enough to pass on its patterns. The human nervous system, shaped across thousands of generations of uncertain eating, learned to stay capable through the empty hours. And that learning is still inside you, still operating quietly, still available. There is something worth pausing on here as you feel the weight of this hour and the quietness of the room around you. The hunger you have felt in your own life, the ordinary midday hunger, the late-night restlessness, the slow fade of appetite in the small hours, that hunger is ancient, older than any word for it, older than any culture that tried to schedule it or manage it or explain it. It is a biological inheritance from a long line of people who navigated uncertainty with their whole bodies and survived. When you feel it, you are feeling something your oldest ancestors also felt, in different landscapes, under different skies, with the same body. But tonight there is no urgency in it. Tonight you are warm and still, and the ancient system that was built to keep you searching and moving and surviving is asked to do something much simpler. It is asked to rest. The signals that once guided people across open plains are quiet now. The hormones that sharpened attention under the old hunger are settling into the slower rhythms of the late hour. Your body, built for variability and uncertainty, has arrived at a moment of unusual stillness, and it knows, the way old things know, how to be still. As you listen, let the image come slowly. A small fire in the dark, a long time ago, on flat ground under a wide sky full of stars. A group of people settled around the warmth, some sleeping already, some watching the embers. They ate today, or perhaps they did not, but the worry of it has quieted for now. The night is doing what nights always did, passing slowly, carrying the hours forward without asking anything of the people beneath it. And in the morning the search will begin again, as it always did, unhurried by anything that happened in the dark. But that is the morning. This is the night. And the night, for as long as humans have lived beneath it, has always been for rest. If the first chapter was about the landscape, the open plains and uncertain hunts, and the fire burning low at the end of a day that may or may not have included a meal, then this chapter is about something smaller and quieter. It is about what was happening inside the body during those long spaces between eating, not as a medical lecture, not as a list of hormones and pathways, but as a story. Because the body has a story too, and it is one of the oldest stories there is, the story of a system built not for abundance, but for endurance, built not for the certainty of tomorrow's breakfast, but for the long, patient work of surviving without it. Begin with something simple. The last meal has been eaten. The fire is low. The group is settling for the night, and there is nothing left to consume until the search begins again in the morning, or perhaps the day after, if the landscape offers little. The body, which has just spent hours processing what it was given, begins to shift. Not dramatically, not in a way that would wake you or send any sharp alarm through the system. Quietly, the way a river changes course over centuries, gradually, intelligently, without urgency. The body begins the long, practiced work of managing the space between. The first thing it does is draw on what it has already stored close at hand. In the liver and the muscles, there are small reserves of a substance called glycogen, a compact form of sugar held in readiness for exactly this kind of moment. As the hours pass without new energy arriving, the body begins to release this glycogen slowly back into the bloodstream, keeping the brain supplied, keeping the muscles ready, keeping the whole system running at a level that would allow, if necessary, a sudden sprint after prey or a long walk to the next water source. The body does not wait to be asked. It manages. It has always managed. It was built to manage. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The idea that hunger means the body is failing, that the absence of food is a kind of emergency, a red light on a dashboard, a signal that something has gone badly wrong, is a modern interpretation of a very ancient and very functional process. In the environments where the human body was shaped, the absence of food was not an emergency. It was Tuesday. It was Wednesday. It was the dry season, or the day after a failed hunt, or the morning before the group reached the next valley where the fruit trees grew. The body had lived inside that absence for hundreds of thousands of years. It knew exactly what to do. As the glycogen stores begin to draw down, a process that takes many hours, not minutes, the body begins a second, deeper transition. Hormones shift their balance. Insulin, which rises when food arrives and helps direct energy into storage, begins to fall. In its place, other signals rise, glucagon among them, a hormone that encourages the liver to continue releasing stored energy and that begins to direct the body's attention towards its longer-term reserves. The fat tissue, distributed throughout the body, holds energy in a form so concentrated that a relatively small amount can sustain a person across a remarkable span of time. The body turns toward it the way a traveler turns toward provisions packed for a long journey, not in panic, but in the quiet confidence of preparation. For the people sleeping around the dying fire on the ancient plain, this transition was happening in every body in the circle. The children curled near the warmth, the elders whose joints had learned the shape of every season, the hunters whose muscles still carried the memory of the day's movement. All of them, in the quiet of sleep, were running through the same ancient metabolic program, the one written into the species across generations of irregular eating, the one that said, "We have been here before. We know how to do this. Rest now. The body will manage through the dark." There is a particular detail about hunger that gets lost in modern conversations about food and appetite, and it is worth recovering tonight. Hunger does not climb in a straight line from mild discomfort to crisis. It moves in waves. It rises, and then, even without any food arriving, it recedes. Not because it has been solved, but because the body has adjusted. The hormones have shifted. The metabolism has found another source. The urgency passes, and in its place comes something that early humans would have recognized without needing words for it. A kind of settled readiness, the feeling of a body that has accepted the situation and is working within it, alert and capable and patient. This wave-like quality of hunger was not an accident of design. It was essential. A body that sent escalating, unrelenting distress signals every hour without food would have been a body in constant crisis, consuming its own attention, disrupting sleep, interfering with the cooperation and coordination that early human groups depended on. Instead, the body learned to modulate, to signal need without overwhelming function, to keep the person capable while also nudging them, gently and repeatedly, toward the search. The hunger of early humans was not the frantic hunger of modern skipped lunches. It was something steadier, more patient, more deeply integrated into the rhythm of a life that expected gaps. As the night deepens and the fire on the ancient plain goes fully dark, the sleeping bodies enter their slowest metabolic state. The brain, always the most demanding organ for energy, draws on its carefully maintained supply. The muscles rest and repair. The fat reserves release their energy in a slow, steady stream, like a lamp burning through the long hours. There is no crisis in any of this. There is only the quiet competence of a system that has done this 10,000 times, in 10,000 different bodies, in 10,000 different landscapes, across the full sweep of human time. The body at rest in the dark, managing the space between meals, is doing one of the things it does best. Let yourself feel that now, if you can, not as a thought to analyze, but as a simple physical reality. Your body is doing this right now, in the dark, as you listen. Whatever you last ate, however many hours ago, your body has been managing the interval since then, with the same quiet intelligence it inherited from every generation before you. The glycogen releasing, the hormones shifting, the fat reserves available and patient, the brain supplied, the system running, not waiting to be rescued by breakfast, simply running, the way it was designed to run, in the long spaces between, in the dark, in the ancient and unhurried rhythm of a species that learned, over deep time, how to wait. There is a particular kind of mourning that appears again and again in the deep record of human life, not written down because writing had not yet been invented, but preserved in the bones and tools and ash layers that archaeologists read the way others read pages. It is the morning after a night of little or nothing. The fire has gone cold. The stores from the last successful hunt have been consumed. The group stirs in the gray light, and without discussion, without a plan written anywhere but in the shared knowledge of people who have done this together many times before, the hunters begin to move. This is the morning of the hunt, and it begins, as almost everything in early human life began, with hunger. We tend to imagine the prehistoric hunt as a dramatic event, a sudden explosive chase across open ground, a struggle, a kill. And sometimes it was that, but more often the archaeological and anthropological evidence suggests something quieter and more demanding, something that required not speed alone, but patience, not just physical strength, but the ability to read a landscape the way a careful reader reads a text, tracking the faint impressions in soft earth, the broken stems of grass, the direction of disturbed dust, the behavior of birds circling at a distance. The hunt was, before it was anything else, a long act of attention. The hunters who left camp in the early morning light were not running, they were walking, a steady, energy-conserving pace across terrain that might cover many miles before any animal was sighted. The human body, shaped by millions of years of bipedal movement, is extraordinarily well suited to this kind of sustained travel. Not the fastest creature on the savanna by any measure, but among the most enduring. The capacity to walk long distances at a moderate pace, cooling efficiently through sweat while other animals overheat, is one of the defining physical inheritances of the human species. The hunters moved through the morning not as the fastest thing in the landscape, but as the most persistent. And all the while, the body was running on what it had, which this morning was less than usual. The glycogen stores from the previous day's eating had drawn down through the night. The fat reserves were supplying a steady background of energy, enough to keep the limbs moving and the mind clear. And here is the detail that rewards attention. The hunters were not impaired by their hunger. They were, in certain measurable ways, sharpened by it. The hormones associated with mild food scarcity, among them a modest rise in the stress hormones that promote alertness and focus, were doing exactly what they were designed to do. The hungry hunter was not a diminished hunter. In many respects, the hungry hunter was the most attentive version of the hunter that the body could produce. This seems counterintuitive from a modern vantage point, where hunger is so often described as a fog, a distraction, a drop in concentration. And it is true that severe, prolonged hunger impairs cognition. But mild to moderate hunger, the kind that arrives after several hours without food, the kind that a hunter on a morning search would carry, operates differently. It signals the nervous system toward alertness. It narrows attention. It makes the person more present in the landscape, more sensitive to movement and sound, and the small anomalies that might indicate an animal nearby. The body, facing the prospect of continued scarcity, turns up its perceptual sensitivity. It is trying to help. Hours might pass this way, the sun climbing from the horizon toward midday, the hunters moving in loose coordination, communicating in low voices and gestures, reading the terrain. They might find tracks and follow them for miles, only to lose them where the ground hardened. They might sight an animal at a distance and begin the slow approach, the kind that requires moving only when the animal's head is down, freezing when it lifts, covering ground so gradually that an hour's work might close the gap by only 100 yards. All of this on empty stomachs, all of this in heat, all of this sustained by the ancient metabolic program that had been running quietly since the fire went cold the night before. And then, sometimes, not always, never reliably, the hunt succeeded. The animal was close enough, the throw was true, or the coordinated chase had been sustained long enough that the prey, built for speed but not endurance, had finally slowed. The kill was made. And in the minutes and hours that followed, the group's situation changed completely. What had been absence became abundance, suddenly and completely. The body that had been running on reserves was now presented with more food than it could use in a single sitting, and the ancient system shifted again, the hormones of storage rising, the appetite opening, the meal beginning in earnest around the carcass on the open ground. The meal that followed a successful hunt was not the quiet, scheduled affair of a modern dinner table. It was something older and more generous, the whole group eating together, the children brought forward, the most nutritious parts of the animal consumed first, organ meats rich in fat and vitamins, marrow extracted carefully from the cracked long bones, the liver, the heart, the kidneys, foods that today might seem unusual, but that represented the densest concentration of available nutrients in the early human diet. The group ate thoroughly and well, because the body, wise from long experience, understood that this abundance was not permanent. Tomorrow might bring nothing. Tonight, the meal was everything. What is striking when you hold the whole arc of this day in your mind, the cold morning, the long walk, the hours of patient searching, the sudden abundance, and the long meal at the end of it, is how completely unlike our modern relationship with food it was. Not worse, not better, simply calibrated to a different set of conditions. Conditions in which the gap between meals was not a personal failure or a scheduling problem, but a structural feature of the environment. Conditions in which the body's capacity to function through that gap was not a curiosity, but a survival requirement. The hunter who could not think clearly while hungry did not return with food. Over enough generations, that mattered. As you lie still in the quiet of this hour, let the day's hunt dissolve slowly into the background. the long walk cooling into the stillness of the body at rest, the abundance of the evening meal settling into the slow rhythms of sleep. The hunters have returned. The fire is burning again. The children are fed. Somewhere in the deep past of your own biology, this scene has played out more times than any number can hold. The search, the waiting, the finding, the eating, the rest. The cycle that shaped the body you carry tonight. The ancient rhythm that still runs beneath everything, patient and unhurried, as old as the first morning a group of people walked out across the open plain into the uncertainty of the day, trusting the body to carry them through. Not all hunger in the ancient world arrived because the hunt had failed. Some of it arrived on schedule, as regular and predictable as the turning of the year, written into the landscape long before any human tried to read it. The dry season, the deep cold, the months between the last harvest of wild fruit and the first new growth of spring. These were not emergencies, they were seasons, and the people who lived within them did not experience them as catastrophes to be solved, but as passages to be navigated, periods of less following periods of more, in the long annual rhythm that shaped life as completely as the rising and setting of the sun. In the African environments where the earliest humans lived, the year divided itself along lines of rain. The wet season brought abundance, grasses seeding, fruits ripening, rivers running full, animals gathering near water in numbers that made hunting more reliable. The dry season reversed all of this. Grasses turned to straw, fruit trees stood bare, rivers narrowed to threads or disappeared entirely into sand. Animals dispersed across vast distances in search of the water that remained. The landscape that had been generous became austere, and the people within it adjusted their expectations accordingly. They had always done this. Their grandparents had done it, their grandparents' grandparents. The adjustment was not a crisis response, it was an inheritance. What the body did during these lean seasons is one of the most quietly remarkable things in the whole story of human biology. It did not simply endure, it adapted, shifting its metabolic priorities in ways that preserved function while reducing expenditure. The rate at which energy was burned through baseline processes slowed slightly, conserving the reserves that had been built up during the months of abundance. Appetite, rather than escalating in desperation, modulated, the hormonal systems learning over evolutionary time to prevent the kind of frantic overconsumption that would burn through reserves too quickly. The body in the lean season was not a body in distress. It was a body executing a very old, very practiced program. The people themselves did not simply wait out the lean season in camp. They moved. Movement was the primary response to scarcity, following the water, tracking the animals that followed the water, expanding the range of the group's search to include territories that might not be visited in the abundant months. In some regions, this meant seasonal migration across hundreds of miles, timed to align with the flowering and fruiting cycles of plants that grew in different elevations or different landscapes. The knowledge required to navigate these migrations was extensive and detailed. Which plants grew where, which routes were passable in the dry months, where water could be found underground by reading the surface vegetation. This knowledge was not written, it was carried in memory, passed from the elders to the young by the slow transmission of living together. Children grew up understanding the lean season not as an interruption of normal life, but as a part of it. They learned which plants were edible in the dry months when the preferred foods were gone, the bitter roots that required processing, the insects that could be gathered in large numbers and provided surprising amounts of protein and fat, the seeds that could be cracked and ground on flat stones to produce a coarse meal. The range of what counted as food expanded in the lean season, drawing on a knowledge of the landscape's resources that went far deeper than the preferred foods of the abundant months. The group ate what the season offered, and the season always offered something if you knew where to look. There is a patience embedded in this way of life that is difficult to fully imagine from the vantage point of a world where food is available at any hour. It is not the patience of resignation, the patience of people who have given up and are simply waiting for things to improve. It is the patience of competence, the patience of people who know the season will turn, who have watched it turn every year of their lives, who carry in their bodies the metabolic inheritance of every generation that survived this same passage before them. The lean season was hard. It required effort and knowledge and endurance, but it was not unknown. It was the familiar difficulty, the expected trial, the passage that every year asked the group to demonstrate again that it had what the season required. The social dimension of the lean season was as important as the biological one. Sharing, which was a central feature of early human group life in all seasons, became more critical when resources were scarce. The successful forager returned to the group and distributed what had been found. The person who had gone out and found nothing was fed by the person who had found more than enough. This reciprocal generosity was not simply kindness, though kindness was part of it. It was a survival strategy embedded so deeply in the social structure of early human groups that it had become, over time, something that felt like an obligation, a moral weight that attached itself to the act of withholding. The group that shared survived the lean season. The group that did not, did not. As the lean season stretched on, weeks, sometimes months, the bodies of the group underwent the slow recalibration that the ancient metabolic program was built for. The fat reserves that had been accumulated during abundance were drawn down steadily and carefully. Movements became more economical, covering necessary distances without excess expenditure. Sleep, in many hunter-gatherer societies observed by anthropologists, appears to increase during lean periods, the body conserving energy by spending more hours in the restorative stillness of rest. The lean season was, in a quiet way, a season of sleeping more deeply, of moving more slowly, of letting the body do the long, patient work of sustaining itself through the months of less. There is something in this that speaks directly to the hour you are in right now, the quietness of late night, the body cooling and slowing, the mind releasing its grip on the day's details and settling into something older and more spacious. This is the ancient resting state, the metabolic mode that early humans entered every night and deepened during every lean season, the mode in which the body does its most careful and its most restorative work. You are in it now. The lean season and the late night share the same biological grammar. Less activity, less intake, more restoration. The body turning inward and attending to itself with a thoroughness that the busy, fed, active hours do not allow. The season of less always ended. That is the other thing worth carrying as you drift toward sleep tonight. In every landscape where early humans lived, the dry season gave way eventually to rain. The cold gave way to warmth. The bare branches filled again with new growth, and the animals returned to the places where water was running, and the hunt became possible again, and the abundance returned, as it always had, not as a reward for endurance, but simply as the next turn of the cycle that had always been turning. The lean season was real and demanding and required everything the body and the group had to offer, but it was a passage, not an ending. The body knew this, at some level below language, the same way it knows, tonight, that the stillness of sleep is not an ending either. It is simply the passage into the next part of the cycle, and the cycle, as it always has, will carry you through. There is a substance in the human body that has been misunderstood more thoroughly than almost anything else in the story of human biology. It is carried quietly, distributed beneath the skin and around the organs, accumulated slowly during times of plenty, and drawn down carefully during times of scarcity. It is one of the oldest features of the human body's design, older than language, older than tools, older than the first fire lit by human hands. And in the modern world, it is regarded almost universally as a problem, a sign of excess, something to be reduced, fought, eliminated. But in the world that shaped the human body, fat was not a problem. Fat was the reason the species survived. To understand what the body stored and why, we need to return to the landscape, the ancient landscape of uncertain hunting and seasonal scarcity, the landscape where food arrived in pulses rather than at scheduled intervals, where a week of abundance might be followed by days of very little. In that landscape, the question that natural selection was answering over thousands of generations was not how to build a body that stayed lean in all conditions. It was how to build a body that survived the lean season. And the answer it arrived at, refined across an almost incomprehensible span of time, was to build a body that could carry its own provisions, that could convert the surplus of the good days into a reserve that would sustain it through the difficult ones. Fat tissue, viewed through this lens, is a form of storage technology, the most sophisticated and energy-dense storage system that biological evolution has produced. A single pound of body fat contains roughly the energy equivalent of a day and a half of moderate activity. Across the full reserves of a healthy adult, the stored energy is sufficient to sustain life for weeks without any incoming food at all. This is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. It is the solution that the long pressure of uncertain environments produced in the human body over hundreds of thousands of years of selection for survival under scarcity. The process by which the body builds these reserves is equally elegant. When food arrives, after a successful hunt, during the abundant weeks of the wet season, when fruit is ripe and plentiful and the gathering has gone well, the body does not simply use what it needs and discard the rest. It captures the surplus. Insulin rises in response to incoming energy, directing the cells to take up glucose, to rebuild glycogen stores, and when those stores are full, to convert the remaining energy into fat and deposit it in the body's long-term reserves. This process happens automatically, without conscious direction, in every human body every time a meal exceeds immediate need. It has been happening in human bodies for as long as humans have existed. What is particularly striking about the human fat storage system is its distribution. Unlike many other animals which tend to store fat in specific, localized deposits, humans distribute fat across the body in ways that serve multiple functions simultaneously. The subcutaneous fat layer beneath the skin provides insulation against cold, crucial in the expanding range of environments that early humans moved into as they spread across the globe from Africa into cooler climates. Fat around the organs provides cushioning and protection. And the particular distribution of fat in the human body, including the specific patterns seen in women during reproductive years, reflects millions of years of selection, not just for survival, but for the sustained demands of pregnancy and nursing, the moments in human life when the body's caloric reserves are drawn on most heavily and most consistently. The drawing down of those reserves, the mobilization of stored fat back into usable energy, is as carefully regulated as the storage process itself. When food intake falls, insulin levels decline, and the hormone glucagon rises, signaling fat cells to begin releasing their contents back into the bloodstream as fatty acids. These fatty acids travel to the muscles, the heart, and other tissues and are burned as fuel. The liver can convert some fatty acids into ketone bodies, an alternative fuel source that the brain can use when glucose is limited. This entire process unfolds gradually, over hours and days, in a carefully orchestrated sequence that keeps the body functional through extended periods without food. It is not a desperate improvisation. It is a planned response to a planned contingency. Early humans would not have had words for any of this. They would not have known about insulin or glucagon or fatty acids or ketone bodies. But they would have known, in the embodied, practical way that people know things they have lived through many times, that the body could carry them through the lean days, that the hunger of the dry season, real and present as it was, did not mean collapse, that the person who had eaten well during the months of abundance arrived at the months of scarcity with something inside them that would sustain the search. The body's storage system was not a scientific concept to early humans. It was a lived experience of resilience, the quiet confidence of a body that had been here before and knew, without needing to reason about it, that it would get through. There is a remarkable consistency to this system across the full range of human populations. Fat storage and mobilization follow the same basic biological logic in every human body on Earth, in populations that evolved in tropical savannas and populations that evolved in Arctic tundra, in bodies shaped by thousands of years of fishing cultures and bodies shaped by thousands of years of pastoral herding. The details vary. Different populations show different tendencies in where and how readily they store fat, shaped by the specific scarcity pressures of their ancestral environments. But the fundamental system is universal. Every human body can store energy as fat, and every human body can mobilize that fat when intake falls. This universality is one of the clearest signs that the system is ancient, older than the divergence of human populations, written into the species before it spread across the world. In the modern world, the body's ancient storage system encounters conditions it was never designed for, an environment of nearly continuous abundance, where the signals that once triggered conservation are rarely given a chance to operate, where the fat accumulated during periods of high intake is rarely called upon to sustain the body through extended scarcity. The result is a mismatch between an ancient system and a modern environment, a system built for oscillation, running in conditions of near constant surplus. This is not a judgment, and it is not the focus of tonight's story. It is simply context, the recognition that what the body does is very old, and the world in which it now does it is very new, and the distance between those two realities is one of the quiet tensions at the center of modern human life. But tonight, that distance closes a little. In the dark, in the stillness, with the days eating behind you and the night's long fast beginning, the ancient system is running exactly as it was designed to run. The stored energy is available and patient. The metabolic transition is underway, quiet, competent, unhurried. Your body is doing what bodies have done every night for 200,000 years, drawing on the reserves of the good hours to carry itself through the dark ones. It does not need your attention or your direction. It has been doing this since long before attention or direction were things the species possessed. Rest and let it work. The storage was always for exactly this: the long, restorative dark, the passage through the night, the ancient and reliable bridge between one day's eating and the next. There is a moment that appears, in one form or another, in nearly every account of early human life that anthropologists and archaeologists have been able to reconstruct. It is not the moment of the kill, though that comes first. It is not the moment of the first bite, though that follows. It is the moment just before the eating begins, the moment when the food that has been found or caught or gathered is divided among the people who are present. The moment of distribution, the moment when whatever has been secured by the effort of one or several becomes, by the oldest social agreement in the human story, the property of the group. This moment, quiet, practical, ancient, may be the single most important thing that allowed the human species to survive the uncertainty of the world it was born into. Sharing food is so fundamental to human social life that it is easy to take for granted, to see it as a simple expression of generosity or affection, rather than what it also is, which is a technology, a survival technology developed and refined over hundreds of thousands of years, as essential to the persistence of early human groups as the hand axe or the fire. In a world where the outcome of any given day's hunt was uncertain, where one person might return with abundance and another with nothing, where the lean season could reduce the entire group's intake for weeks at a time, the distribution of food across the group was the mechanism that smoothed out the peaks and valleys of individual fortune. It was, in the most literal sense, what kept people alive on the days when their own efforts were not enough. The archaeological evidence for food sharing reaches back further than most people realize. At sites associated with early Homo sapiens and even earlier hominins, the distribution of animal bones across a campsite suggests that large carcasses were not consumed by individuals in isolation. The pattern of cut marks, the scattering of skeletal elements, the association of remains with central hearth areas, all of this points towards communal consumption. The meat was brought to a central location and processed there, in the presence of the group, in a pattern that implies distribution rather than individual hoarding. The hearth was not just a cooking site, it was the table around which the ancient social contract of food sharing was enacted every time a meal was possible. Within the group, the logic of sharing created a web of mutual insurance. If you returned from the hunt with meat today and gave a portion to the family that returned with nothing, you were not simply being generous. You were investing in a system that would return food to you on the day when your hunt failed and theirs succeeded. The anthropologist Marshall Solings described hunter-gatherer sharing as a form of generalized reciprocity, giving without explicit expectation of immediate return, but within a social context of eventual return was deeply understood by everyone. It was not a ledger system precisely tracked and balanced. It was a moral atmosphere, a shared understanding that the group fed its members and that the members fed the group, and that this mutual obligation was the difference between survival and its absence. Children were the most direct beneficiaries of this system, and in some ways its most important justification. A human child is dependent on adult provisioning for an extraordinarily long time compared to the young of other species. Years of partial dependence, followed by years of full dependence on adult-provided food before the child can contribute meaningfully to the group's food acquisition. This extended dependency is one of the distinctive features of human development, and it would have been impossible to sustain without a social system of food sharing. The child who had not yet learned to hunt or gather effectively was fed by the adults who had. And the adults who fed those children were, in a very direct sense, feeding the future of the group, investing in the next generation of hunters and gatherers who would one day sustain the generation that was old. The lean season tested this system most severely, and the lean season was when the system mattered most. When food was abundant, sharing was easy. There was enough for everyone, and the distribution cost little. When food was scarce, sharing required something more, the willingness to give from a supply that was already inadequate, to accept a smaller portion so that a child or an elder or an injured person could have enough. This was the moral weight at the center of early human social life, and it did not go unnoticed. Across the ethnographic record of hunter-gatherer societies studied in recent centuries, anthropologists consistently find that the failure to share, the hoarding of food in times of scarcity, is among the most serious social violations a person can commit. It is met not with indifference, but with anger, with social exclusion, sometimes with violence. The obligation to share was enforced because the group understood, at a level that did not require articulation, that the refusal to share was a threat to survival itself. There is something in this ancient economy of sharing that speaks to something still recognizable in human social life today: the particular pleasure of a shared meal, the way food eaten in company tastes different from food eaten alone, the instinct to offer what you have to a person who has arrived hungry. These are not trivial preferences. They are the living residue of a very long social history in which the shared meal was the primary mechanism of group survival. The table, in whatever form it has taken across human cultures, from a flat rock beside a fire to a kitchen in a modern apartment, carries the memory of the ancient hearth, the central gathering point around which the social contract of feeding one another was enacted night after night across the full span of human existence. On the nights when the hunt had succeeded and the group was gathered around the fire with enough for everyone, the atmosphere would have been something worth trying to imagine. Not the restrained, scheduled affair of a modern dinner, but something looser and more openly joyful. The relief of hunger answered after days of searching, the warmth of the fire, the voices of the group at their most relaxed, the children fed and settling into sleep at the edges of the firelight. The abundance of the meal was inseparable from the social experience of it, from the fact that it was shared, that everyone present was eating, that the group had made it through another passage of uncertainty and arrived together at this moment of warmth and sufficiency. Food and community in early human life were not separate things, they were the same thing. As the meal wound down and the fire settled into coals and the group began to arrange themselves for sleep, the social bonds that the shared meal had reinforced were doing their own kind of work, the quiet biological work of reducing stress hormones, lowering the vigilance of the nervous system, creating the physiological conditions in which deep restorative sleep becomes possible. The body that has eaten and been warm and been among its people is a body that can release the alertness it has been carrying through the uncertain hours of the day. It can afford finally to let go, to descend into the slow, deep rhythms of sleep where the body's real restorative work takes place. The shared meal was not just nourishment for the body. It was the social signal that said, the day is over, the group is fed, you can rest now. Let that signal reach you now, in whatever form it takes, across the distance of all those thousands of years. The day is over. Whatever the day required of you, the searching, the managing, the enduring, it is behind you now. You are warm. The people you care for are accounted for. The ancient nervous system that was built to stay alert through uncertainty has received, in the quiet of this hour, the oldest possible permission to release. The group is gathered. The fire, in whatever form it takes in your life, has been tended, and the night, as it has always done, is asking nothing more of you than to rest inside it, the way the earliest people rested after the meal was shared and the fire burned low and the darkness settled gently over everything, as it is settling now.
For most of the human story, the relationship between people and food was a relationship of pursuit. You went to where the food was. You followed the herds. You moved with the seasons. You read the landscape for signs of what it might offer, and you adjusted your position accordingly. Always in motion, always responsive to the shifting availability of the world around you. And then, roughly 12,000 years ago, in the most recent fraction of the full span of human existence, a moment so recent in evolutionary terms that the body has barely had time to register it, something changed. People stopped following the food. They stayed, and they made the food come to them.
The shift from hunting and gathering to agriculture is one of the most examined transitions in all of human history, and it is also one of the most misunderstood. The popular version of the story presents it as an obvious upgrade, the moment when clever humans finally figured out a better way to eat, leaving behind the precarious, exhausting life of the hunter-gatherer for the security and abundance of the farm. But the evidence, read carefully, tells a more complicated story. The first farmers did not immediately eat better than the hunter-gatherers who came before them. In many measurable respects, at least in the early centuries of agriculture, they ate worse. What they gained was not abundance. What they gained was predictability. And predictability, it turns out, changed everything, including the ancient relationship between the human body and hunger that had been stable for 200,000 years. The origins of agriculture were not a single event in a single place. They were a process, slow, uneven, happening independently in multiple locations across the world over a span of several thousand years. In the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, wild wheat and barley were gradually domesticated, their seeds selected over generations for traits that made them more useful to the people harvesting them. In China, rice and millet were brought under cultivation along river valleys. In Mesoamerica, maize was developed from a wild grass called teosinte through a process of selection so gradual that its full arc took thousands of years. In each case, the shift was not a sudden decision, but a slow drift, a gradual deepening of the relationship between particular human groups and particular plants, until the plants and the people had become dependent on each other in ways that neither could easily reverse. The landscape around the first agricultural settlements began to change in ways that had no precedent in the natural world. The wild, varied, seasonally shifting mosaic of plants that hunter-gatherers had navigated was replaced, around the settlement, with something more uniform, the same crops planted in the same fields, tended through the same seasonal cycle year after year. The diversity of the hunter-gatherer diet, which had drawn on dozens or hundreds of different plant and animal species across the range of the group's movements, was replaced by something narrower. The first farmers ate more of fewer things. And this narrowing, while it brought the stability of a predictable harvest, brought with it vulnerabilities that the mobile, diverse diet of the hunter-gatherer had largely avoided. The skeletal evidence from early agricultural populations is striking and consistent. Compared to the hunter-gatherers who preceded them, the first farmers show signs of nutritional stress, reduced stature, dental cavities from carbohydrate-rich diets, evidence of deficiency diseases that appear rarely in pre-agricultural populations. The bones tell the story of a diet that was calorie sufficient in the good years, but narrower in its nutritional range, and catastrophically insufficient in the bad years, when the harvest failed, when drought struck, when disease moved through the crops. The lean season of the hunter-gatherer, managed by mobility and the body's ancient metabolic flexibility, was replaced by something more extreme and less manageable, the famine, the complete failure of the food supply in a population that had become too large and too settled to simply move on. And yet the people stayed. Generation after generation, the agricultural settlements persisted and grew, even as the skeletal evidence records the nutritional costs. Why? because what agriculture offered, even with its costs, was something that the body and the social group valued enormously: the ability to plan. To know with reasonable confidence that food would be available at a particular time in a particular place. To build storage systems that could carry a surplus across the months between harvests. To support a larger group in a smaller area than hunting and gathering could sustain. The certainty that agriculture offered was not perfect, it never has been, but it was of a different order than the uncertainty of the hunt, and the human social appetite for that kind of security was, it turns out, very strong. The storage technologies that agriculture required and produced were transformative in ways that went far beyond the practical management of food. The granary, the pit lined with clay, the ceramic vessel, the raised storehouse, changed the relationship between the human group and time. For the first time, it was possible to eat food that had been grown in a different season, to carry the summer's abundance into the winter's scarcity, to build a buffer between the cycle of production and the cycle of need. The body's internal storage system, the fat reserves that had carried early humans through the lean season, now had an external counterpart. The group could store outside the body what the body had previously been required to store within it. This was a profound shift, and its consequences rippled through every aspect of human social life.
With storage came ownership. With ownership came inequality. With inequality came the social structures, the hierarchies, the divisions of labor, the distinctions between those who controlled the granary and those who did not, that would eventually produce the full complexity of civilized life. None of this happened quickly or deliberately. It accumulated slowly, over centuries and millennia, as the logic of settled agricultural life worked its way through the social arrangements of the groups that had adopted it. The world of the first farmers was not yet the world of cities and kings and written law, but the seeds of all of those things were present in the moment a group first decided to stay in one place and tend the plants that grew there, because staying meant owning, and owning meant protecting, and protecting eventually meant governing.
For the human body, the agricultural transition represented a challenge of a kind it had never faced before. The ancient metabolic system, built for variability, for the pulse of feast and fast, for the seasonal rhythm of abundance and scarcity, was now being asked to operate in conditions of relative constancy. Carbohydrates, which had been a seasonal and intermittent part of the hunter-gatherer diet, now became the dominant food source. Insulin, which had evolved to manage occasional surges of incoming energy, was now called upon to respond to multiple grain-based meals every day. The body adapted, as it always does, but the adaptation was incomplete, because 12,000 years is not very long in evolutionary time, and the system that was being asked to adapt had been shaped across 200,000 years of very different conditions. As you drift now toward the deeper hours of the night, carry this thought lightly, that the body you inhabit is older than the farm. It was shaped in a world that the farm has largely replaced, and it carries the memory of that older world in its hormones and its metabolism and its capacity to endure the spaces between meals without distress. The first farmers changed the human relationship with food in ways that have compounded across every generation since. But the body, patient and conservative, and shaped by a history far longer than agriculture's 12,000 years, has not entirely forgotten what it was before the fields were planted and the granaries were built, and the ancient rhythm of the hunt was traded for the steadier, narrower, more predictable rhythm of the harvest. Tonight, in the quiet and the dark, that older body is still present, still running its ancient program, still carrying you through the night the way it always has, steadily, quietly, without asking anything of you, but rest. There is a particular kind of fear that agriculture introduced into human life that hunting and gathering, for all its uncertainty, had never quite produced in the same form. The hunter-gatherer who found nothing today could move tomorrow, could follow the herds to a different valley, could shift the group's range toward a landscape that the dry season had not yet stripped bare, could draw on the mobility that was the fundamental survival strategy of a people who owned nothing heavier than what they could carry. The farmer could not move. The farmer had built something, had planted something, had invested months of labor in a particular piece of ground, and the crop was either going to come in or it was not, and if it did not, there was no other valley to walk to. There was only the empty field, and the full granary from last year that was no longer full, and the long months of winter ahead with less than had been counted on.
The harvest failure is one of the oldest catastrophes in the settled human world and one of the most recurring. It appears in the earliest written records of every agricultural civilization, in the cuneiform tablets of Mesopotamia, in the administrative papyri of ancient Egypt, in the oracle bone inscriptions of Bronze Age China. It runs through the entire written history of humanity as a persistent and terrible possibility, the shadow that falls across every planting season, the question that every farming community has always asked of the sky: will there be enough? The anxiety encoded in that question is different in kind from the uncertainty of the hunt. The hunter could not know if the animal would be there, but the farmer knew exactly what was at stake, had watched the crop grow, had estimated the yield, had made calculations about how many people it needed to feed through how many months. And the failure of that calculation, when it came, arrived not as the simple absence that the hunter knew, but as the destruction of a plan, the ruin of something that had been carefully built.
The causes of harvest failure were as varied as the landscapes in which agriculture had taken root. Drought was the most common and the most feared. The rains that did not come, or came too late, or came all at once in a flood that flattened the grain and rotted the roots. But drought was only one of the ways the sky could refuse its cooperation. Unseasonable frost could kill crops that had been growing for months. Locusts, those ancient and terrible agents of agricultural catastrophe, could descend on a landscape in clouds so dense they darkened the sun and strip a field that had been ready for harvest down to bare stalks in a matter of hours. Plant diseases moved through fields of genetically similar crops with a speed that the diversity of wild plant communities would have resisted. And in the early centuries of agriculture, when the techniques of soil management were still being learned, the ground itself could become exhausted, drained of the nutrients that the same crop planted in the same field year after year steadily removed.
When the harvest failed, the response of the community depended on what reserves it had managed to accumulate and how far those reserves could be stretched. In the good years, the prudent settlement stored more than it needed, filled the granary past the point of immediate sufficiency, set aside a margin against the possibility of a bad year. In some of the earliest agricultural societies, this surplus management was one of the primary functions of the emerging social hierarchy. The chief, the temple, the palace, the institution that collected a portion of every household's harvest and held it in common storage against the collective need. The granary in these contexts was not just a food storage facility. It was a social institution, the physical embodiment of the community's collective insurance against the failure of any individual season.
But reserves could only stretch so far. A single bad harvest could be managed if the stores from the previous year were sufficient. 2 consecutive bad harvests began to threaten even well-prepared communities. 3 could be catastrophic. The historical record of early agricultural civilizations is punctuated by episodes of famine, Events so severe that they disrupted entire societies, drove migrations, collapsed political structures, and left their mark in the skeletal record as years in which the bodies of the people who survived showed the clear physical signs of severe nutritional stress. Children's bones carry in their structure the record of the years in which their growth slowed or stopped, visible in the archaeological record as lines of interrupted development, a permanent physical inscription of the seasons when there was not enough. The social behavior of communities under famine conditions reveals under pressure the same deep logic that governed sharing in the hunter-gatherer world, but stretched to its breaking point. In normal times, the obligation to share food with those who had less was a moral foundation of community life. In famine, that obligation came into direct conflict with the survival imperative of the individual household, the parents who needed to feed their own children before they could feed anyone else's. Historical accounts of famine, from ancient Egypt to medieval Europe to the modern era, describe with terrible consistency the progressive breakdown of the ordinary social bonds around food, the generosity that was easy in abundance becoming impossible in extremity, the community that had shared freely in the good years turning inward, door by door, as the granary emptied and the spring planting seemed further away with every passing week.
And yet, even in the most severe famines, the human impulse toward sharing did not disappear entirely. It contracted, pulling back from the wider community toward the innermost circle of obligation, the family, the household, the people whose faces were the most familiar and whose hunger was the most impossible to ignore. Parents went hungry so that children could eat. Elders refused portions so that the young would have enough. These acts of self-deprivation in the context of collective scarcity are among the most consistent features of the historical and anthropological record of famine, a reminder that the ancient social logic of the shared meal, compressed and tested by extremity, did not vanish but simply contracted to its irreducible core. The group might shrink in the hardest times to the size of a single family, but the group remained.
The body's response to famine, to genuine, extended, severe food deprivation, was the ancient metabolic program running at its most extreme, the fat reserves drawn down past the point of comfortable buffer, the metabolism slowing further than the seasonal adjustment of the lean season, reducing energy expenditure in every system that could be reduced, prioritizing the brain and the heart at the expense of less immediately critical functions. Growth halting in children, whose bodies diverted available energy away from development and toward maintenance. The immune system weakening as the resources it required were redirected. The body in famine was not failing. It was executing the most conservative version of its ancient program, the version that traded everything non-essential for the chance of surviving until the next harvest, the next rain, the next possibility of food. The people who came through the worst famines were, in the most direct biological sense, the people whose bodies were best equipped for the extremity of prolonged scarcity, whose fat reserves had been sufficient, whose metabolic efficiency was highest, whose ancient storage and conservation systems performed most effectively under conditions that would have been unfamiliar to their hunter-gatherer ancestors, but that the underlying biology was, at least partially, prepared for. The harvest failure tested the same systems that the uncertain hunt had tested, but tested them longer and harder and with less of the mobility and dietary diversity that had softened the impact of scarcity in the pre-agricultural world. The body managed because it had always been built to manage, but famine asked more of that management than the ancient landscape had ever required. As the night deepens around you and the body settles further into its slowest rhythms, there is a quiet gratitude available in the simple fact of this moment, the full granary, in whatever form it takes in your life. The distance between where you are tonight and the empty fields and the long winters of the agricultural past. The fear that the harvest failure introduced into human life, the particular dread of the farmer watching the sky for rain that does not come, is one of the oldest and most persistent anxieties in the settled human story. Tonight it is quiet. The stores are sufficient. The body, running its ancient program in the warm dark, is doing what it has always done, carrying you through the night on the reserves of what the day provided, patient and competent and unhurried, the way it has carried every generation before you through every dark, all the way back to the first fire and the first shared meal and the first morning when the people woke and went out again into the uncertain world, trusting the body to be enough.
Every culture that has ever existed has had a feast, not just a meal, and not just a large meal, something more deliberate than that, more socially weighted, more carefully prepared, and more consciously remembered. The feast is the meal that marks something, the end of the harvest, the return of the hunt, the turn of the season, the moment when the community gathers not simply because food is available, but because the gathering itself is the point, because eating together on this particular occasion, in this particular abundance, is the way the community says to itself, "We made it. The lean season is behind us. The stores are full. The cycle has turned again, as it always turns, and we are here together on the other side of it." The feast is the human response to the fact that survival is not guaranteed, and this time, again, it was.
The deep roots of the feast lie in the same ecological reality that shaped everything else about the ancient human relationship with food. In a world of irregular abundance, the arrival of plenty was not a routine event to be quietly managed. It was a significant event, worthy of recognition, of communal response, of the kind of social amplification that transforms a meal into a memory. The successful hunt that brought more than the group could eat in a single sitting, the fruit trees that ripened all at once in an overwhelming abundance that would last only a few days before the fruit fell and rotted, the salmon run that filled the river so thickly that the catching seemed almost effortless, these moments of abundance called for a response proportional to their significance, and the response that early humans developed and that every human culture since has elaborated in its own particular way was the feast. Anthropological observations of hunter-gatherer societies provide a consistent picture of how these moments of abundance were handled. When a large animal was brought down, an animal that provided far more meat than the immediate hunting party could consume, the meat was not quietly eaten by those who had made the kill and stored away in private. It was shared outward, rippling through the social network in widening circles of obligation and generosity. People who lived at some distance from the kill site were summoned. The event became quickly a gathering, not just of the immediate group, but of the broader community of people connected by kinship and alliance, and the long mutual history of having shared food before and expected to share it again. The feast, at its origin, was the social amplification of abundance, the way a community transformed a windfall into a collective experience and a collective memory. The sensory experience of the feast in the ancient world was something that it takes a deliberate act of imagination to recover. We are so accustomed to the availability of rich food that the particular pleasure of abundance after scarcity, the specific quality of eating well after days of eating little, has become difficult to access. But for people whose relationship with food was genuinely uncertain, whose bodies carried the metabolic memory of the lean season, even in the moments of plenty, the feast would have registered with an intensity that modern meals rarely achieve. The richness of the fat from a freshly killed animal, the sweetness of ripe fruit eaten in quantities that the ordinary diet rarely permitted, the warmth of the fire and the loosening of the body that comes when hunger is fully answered, not just partially, not just enough, but more than enough. The feast was the body's deepest satisfaction, made possible by the contrast with everything that had preceded it.
As human societies grew more complex and food production became more reliable, the feast did not disappear, it transformed. In the early agricultural settlements of the Fertile Crescent and the river valleys of China and the highlands of Mesoamerica, the seasonal rhythm of planting and harvest created a new calendar for collective eating: the harvest festival, the first fruits ceremony, the communal meal that marked the safe gathering of the year's food supply. These occasions were not simply practical celebrations of agricultural success. They were charged with religious and social meaning, expressions of gratitude toward the forces that governed rain and sun and soil, affirmations of the community's collective identity, opportunities for the redistribution of surplus from those who had more to those who had less. The feast in the agricultural world became one of the primary mechanisms by which the social bonds of the community were renewed and the inequalities of daily life were temporarily suspended.
In the great river valley civilizations, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, the Yellow River settlements of early China, the feast scaled upward with the complexity of the societies that organized it. The temple festivals of ancient Mesopotamia involved the ritual feeding of the gods, large quantities of bread, beer, meat, and oil presented before the divine statues, in ceremonies that were also, practically, the occasion for large communal meals drawn from the temple stores. The feasts of the Egyptian pharaoh's court were recorded in tomb paintings with a care and detail that suggests their importance. The long tables of bread and roasted meats, and jars of wine and honey, the musicians playing, the servants moving between the guests. These were not simply meals, they were performances of power and piety and collective belonging. The abundance of the feast made visible as evidence that the gods were pleased and the social order was secure. But even in these elaborate, civilized forms, the feast retained its deepest original function: the social management of abundance in a world where abundance remained uncertain. The pharaoh who feasted his court was also, in a practical sense, redistributing surplus. The temple that fed the city during its festivals was drawing on stores that the community had collectively accumulated and was returning a portion of that accumulation to the community in a form that reinforced both gratitude and social cohesion. The feast was always, underneath its ceremonial elaboration, the ancient act of sharing the windfall, the translation of individual or institutional surplus into collective experience, the conversion of food into community. There is a physiology to the feast that mirrors its social significance. The body that has been eating moderately, or less than moderately, in the lean season, responds to the abundance of the feast with a cascade of pleasure signals that go well beyond simple satiation. The opioid receptors in the brain respond to the combination of fat and sugar and social warmth with a depth of satisfaction that the ordinary meal, however adequate, does not produce. The hormones of social bonding, oxytocin among them, rise in the context of communal eating in ways that they do not in solitary consumption. The laughter and the loosening of social restraint that characterizes feast occasions across cultures is not incidental to the feast. It is part of what the feast is for: the physiological reset, the release of the tension that scarcity and uncertainty accumulate in the body over the lean season, the full and generous discharge of the nervous system's long vigilance. When the feast was over,
when the fire had burned down and the food was gone, and the people were settling into the deep, full sleep of genuine satiation, something had changed in the community that had gathered for it. The stories told over the feast would be remembered and repeated. The social bonds reinforced by the shared abundance would carry the community through the next period of scarcity. The gratitude expressed in the ceremonies of the feast, whether directed toward the gods of the agricultural world or toward the forces of the natural world that the hunter-gatherer understood as animate and responsive, would be renewed as the season turned and the planting began again, or the hunt went out again into the uncertain landscape. The feast was not just a meal. It was the community's way of being, briefly and fully, exactly what it needed to be. As you settle now into the quietest hours of the night, let the image of the feast rest gently at the edge of awareness. Not the elaborate feasts of the great civilizations, with their temples and their tomb paintings and their careful administrative records, but the older, simpler feast. The fire on the open ground, the group assembled from their various directions, the food more than enough, for once, for everyone, the children eating freely, the elders settled into the warmth, the voices of the group at their most relaxed and open, carrying across the dark plain, toward a sky so full of stars that the darkness between them is almost an afterthought. This is where the feast began, in exactly this kind of night, around exactly this kind of fire, with exactly this quality of fullness and warmth, and the loosened, grateful, communal ease of people who have come through the uncertain days and arrived together at the abundance. You carry that memory in you tonight, as you always have, even when you do not know it is there. Sleep well inside it.
Every child born into the ancient world was born into a body already prepared for uncertainty, not by choice, not by any decision made on the child's behalf, but by the long, patient work of inheritance, the accumulated biological wisdom of every generation that had come before, passed forward in the quiet language of genes and hormones, and the deep architectural logic of a metabolism shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of irregular eating. The child who arrived into the world of the hunter-gatherer, or the early agricultural village, or the seasonal landscape of any pre-industrial community, carried inside their small body the same ancient program that had carried their ancestors through every lean season, and every failed hunt, and every long night between meals. They had not yet experienced scarcity, but their body already knew how to survive it. Childhood in the ancient world was an education in hunger as much as anything else. Not primarily, not the defining feature of every day, but a recurring presence, woven into the texture of life, in the way that weather was woven into it. The child who grew up in a hunter-gatherer community learned very early that some days the adults returned with food, and some days they did not. That the dry season meant eating differently and eating less. That the large meal after a successful hunt was a gift of the moment, not a promise about tomorrow. This knowledge was not taught in any formal sense. It was simply absorbed through the body's own experience of hunger and satiation cycling through the seasons, through the observation of how the adults around them managed the spaces between meals, through the gradual internalization of the group's deep practical understanding that the body could carry you through the uncertain days if you trusted it to do so. The physical development of children in pre-agricultural and early agricultural societies was directly shaped by the nutritional landscape they grew up in. In the lean months, growth slowed, the body, executing its ancient conservation program, diverting energy away from the energetically expensive work of building new tissue and toward the more immediately critical work of maintaining what already existed. In the abundant months, growth accelerated, a phenomenon that biologists call catch-up growth,
the body seizing the opportunity of plenty to make up some of what the lean months had deferred. The result was not the smooth, steady developmental curve of a child with guaranteed daily nutrition, but something more episodic, a pattern of growth that followed the rhythm of the seasons, expanding and contracting with the availability of food in a way that left its record in the bones.
What children also absorbed, growing up in these communities, was the social knowledge of scarcity, the understanding of how a group behaves when there is not enough, and what is expected of each person within it. They watched the adults divide the food carefully during the lean months, measuring portions with an attention that the abundant months did not require. They understood, without being told in explicit terms, that the elder who refused a portion so that the children could eat more was performing an act of profound social weight, one that would be remembered and honored, and that defined something important about what the group owed its most vulnerable members. They learned that hunger was not a private experience. It was a shared condition, managed collectively, and that the way you behaved within it said something essential about who you were.
The games that children played in hunter-gatherer societies, as observed by anthropologists studying more recent groups, frequently rehearsed the skills of food acquisition, mock hunts, tracking games, the practice of plant identification and gathering. These were not assigned activities or formal lessons. They were play, spontaneous, joyful, driven by the same curiosity and imitative impulse that drives children's play in every culture. But they were play that prepared the body and the mind for the adult work of feeding the group. By the time a child in a hunter-gatherer community was old enough to contribute meaningfully to food acquisition, somewhere in the early teenage years typically, with full proficiency coming in the late teens and early 20s, they had already spent years practicing the skills they would need, absorbing the landscape knowledge that would guide them, and developing the physical endurance that the long days of hunting and gathering required.
The relationship between children and food in early agricultural societies carried a different weight. In the farming community, children contributed to food production from an early age, not as hunters or gatherers, but as workers in the fields, tenders of animals, carriers of water, processors of grain. The agricultural calendar organized the rhythms of childhood in ways that the more fluid life of the hunter-gatherer did not. Planting time and harvest time made specific demands on everyone in the community, including the young, and the child in the farming village grew up understanding their labor as a direct contribution to the food supply that sustained them. The connection between work and eating was explicit and visible in a way that the more indirect connection between the hunt and the meal had not always been. Across both ways of life, however, the central lesson that children absorbed about food was the same, that it was not guaranteed, that its presence required effort and knowledge and cooperation, and that the body's capacity to manage the spaces between its arrival was a resource to be respected rather than a weakness to be corrected. The child who cried from hunger in the lean season was comforted, fed what could be spared, and carried through. But the older child, the adolescent moving toward the adult work of providing for themselves and eventually for a family, was expected to develop the stoic competence of a body that could work through hunger without being undone by it. This was not cruelty, it was preparation, the passing forward of the ancient metabolic wisdom in the form of lived experience. There is a particular kind of resilience that grows in people who have learned in childhood that the body can endure more than the mind's anxiety about it suggests. Not the false resilience of people who have been taught to ignore their needs, but something quieter and more grounded. The practical confidence of people who have been hungry and come through it, who have watched the lean season turn into the abundant one, who carry in their bodies the memory of having been sustained by the ancient program when the food was not there. This resilience was not unique to any one culture or any one time period. It was the common inheritance of every generation that grew up in a world where the meal was not guaranteed, which is to say, virtually every generation in the full span of human history until very recently.
The children of scarcity grew into the adults who fed the next generation of children, who built the fires and made the hunts and planted the fields and managed the granaries and divided the food carefully in the lean months so that the young would have enough to grow on. And those children, in their turn, absorbed the same ancient education, the body's knowledge, the group's knowledge, the seasonal knowledge, the patient, practical wisdom of a species that had always lived in the space between what was needed and what was available, and had always found a way to close that space. This transmission, quiet, embodied, enacted rather than explained, was the deepest form of education the ancient world produced. It did not require schools or books or formal instruction. It required only the long, slow immersion of a child in the life of a community that had learned, across more time than any of them could imagine, how to survive.
As you lie in the quiet of the late hour, let the thought of those children rest gently in your awareness. The children of the ancient campfire and the early farm and every lean season in between. Small bodies carrying the same ancient program you carry tonight, learning in the way that only living teaches you what the body can endure and what the group provides, and how the season always, eventually turns. You are the continuation of that long line of learning. The resilience they developed is in you, not as a memory you can access, but as a capacity you carry, written into the biology that carried you through every difficult day you have ever had, and every night you have passed through without knowing quite how. The children of scarcity became the ancestors of everyone alive today. Their endurance is your inheritance. Carry it lightly into sleep. At some point in the long story of the human relationship with food, hunger stopped being only a physical experience and became a spiritual one. The moment when this happened is impossible to locate precisely. It predates any written record, and its evidence in the archaeological record is suggestive rather than definitive. But the logic of it is not difficult to follow. If you are a person who depends on the rain and the sun and the seasonal turning of the earth for the food that sustains your community, and if you have watched those forces cooperate and refuse their cooperation in ways that determined whether your children ate or went hungry, it is not a large imaginative step to begin relating to those forces as something more than weather, to begin treating them as presences, responsive, potentially persuadable, worthy of address. The gods of the harvest were not invented by priests in temples. They were arrived at, slowly and collectively, by communities of people who needed the rain to come and could not bear to believe that nothing they did would influence whether it did. The earliest evidence of ritual behavior connected to food acquisition predates agriculture by tens of thousands of years. Cave paintings in France and Spain, some of them 30,000 years old or more, depict animals with a care and detail and apparent reverence that suggests they meant something beyond their literal presence, that the act of representing them on the cave wall was not simply decorative, but was connected to the hunt in some way that the painters understood as consequential. Whether these images were intended to bring the animals within range, or to honor them after the kill, or to acknowledge the spiritual dimension of the relationship between the hunter and the hunted, is something we cannot know with certainty. But the care with which they were made, deep in the earth, by firelight, in locations that required difficult access, suggests that something more than aesthetics was at work. Among the hunter-gatherer societies that have been studied by anthropologists in recent centuries, the relationship between the hunt and the sacred is consistently present, though it takes different forms in different cultures. In many such societies, the animal that is killed is addressed with respect, thanked, in effect, for giving its life. The hunter who makes the kill observes protocols that acknowledge the spiritual weight of the act, particular ways of handling the carcass, particular things said or done before or after, particular restrictions on behavior that signal that the kill is not simply a practical transaction, but an event that carries meaning within a larger spiritual framework. These practices are not uniform across cultures, but their prevalence suggests that something deep in the human relationship with food, particularly the killing of animals for food, generates a need for acknowledgement, for ceremony, for the recognition that what has happened is significant.
When agriculture arrived and the sources of food became plants rather than animals, or became plants primarily with animals as a secondary source, the spiritual relationship with food did not diminish. It expanded and in many ways deepened. The farmer's dependence on forces beyond human control was more concentrated and more legible than the hunter-gatherers. The rain had to come at the right time, in the right amount. The sun had to warm the soil without scorching the seedlings. The frost had to hold off until the harvest was in. All of this was visible and measurable and directly consequential in a way that the hunter-gatherers' more distributed dependence on the natural world was not. The farmer knew exactly what was needed and could watch day by day whether it was being provided. And when it was not, when the sky stayed clear through the planting season, when the river ran too low to flood the fields, when the frost came early, the gap between what was needed and what was given was a direct and legible statement by the forces that governed the world.
The response to this legible dependence was the elaboration of a ritual calendar organized around the agricultural cycle, the planting ceremonies and the harvest festivals, the prayers for rain, and the offerings made to the forces that sent or withheld it. In ancient Mesopotamia, the great god Enlil controlled the wind and the weather, and his cooperation with the agricultural ambitions of the farmers in the river valleys below him was sought through the elaborate temple rituals that were among the earliest forms of organized religion. In Egypt, the annual flooding of the Nile, the event on which all Egyptian agriculture depended, was understood as the gift of the gods, and the pharaoh's relationship with those gods was part of what justified his position at the apex of society. In Mesoamerica, the Maya calendar, one of the most sophisticated astronomical systems produced by any ancient civilization, was organized in significant part around the calculation of the optimal planting and harvesting times, the sacred and the agricultural interwoven so completely that separating them would have seemed nonsensical to the people who lived within it.
The gods of the harvest were not abstract philosophical constructs. They were practical necessities, the conceptual technology that communities developed to manage their relationship with the forces that determined whether they ate or went hungry. The priest who performed the planting ceremony was not simply conducting a performance of social solidarity, though that function was also served. He was, from the perspective of the community that sent him, doing necessary work, maintaining the relationship with the divine forces on whose cooperation the harvest depended. The offering made at the temple was not simply a display of piety. It was, in a very real sense, an investment, a portion of the surplus given back to the powers that had provided it, in the expectation that the relationship thus maintained would continue to be productive.
What is striking across the enormous diversity of harvest religions and food-related sacred practices that human cultures have produced is the consistency of certain underlying themes. The acknowledgement of dependence, the recognition embedded in the ritual that the food does not come from human effort alone, but from a cooperation between human work and forces that human work cannot fully control. The expression of gratitude, the feast or the offering that says to whatever powers are understood to be responsible that their provision has been received and is valued, and the appeal for continuation, The prayer or the ceremony or the sacrifice that says, in its various cultural forms, that the community needs this to go on, that the rain is needed again next year, that the harvest that has just been gathered was not the last one needed. These themes are so consistent across cultures that they seem to reflect something fundamental about the human psychological response to the experience of depending on forces beyond your control for the food that keeps you alive.
Even in cultures that did not develop elaborate theologies of agricultural deities, the sacred dimension of food was present in the rituals that surrounded eating. The blessing said before the meal, in whatever form it takes across the world's religious traditions, is a compressed version of the ancient acknowledgement of dependence. The harvest festival, which persists in recognizable form in the traditions of dozens of cultures from the ancient world to the present, is the elaborate version. Both are expressions of the same fundamental recognition, that the food on the table is not simply the product of human labor, that it arrived through a combination of effort and fortune and the cooperation of forces that the eater did not control and cannot take for granted. The gods of the harvest are, in this sense, still present, in the quiet moment before the meal, in the seasonal celebrations that mark the gathering of food, in the persistent human instinct to acknowledge, in some form, that the provision of food is a gift as much as an achievement.
As the agricultural world gave way, over long centuries, to the industrial one, as the distance between the person eating and the forces that produced the food lengthened through supply chains and processing facilities and refrigerated transport, until the rain that fell on a particular field in a particular season became effectively invisible to the person consuming the result, the gods of the harvest did not disappear. They faded, for many people, into the background of a world where the connection between weather and eating was no longer legible in daily life. But they left behind the rituals, the Thanksgiving table, the harvest moon celebration, the first fruit ceremonies that persist in religious traditions around the world. And in those rituals, the ancient acknowledgement remains, waiting to be felt again by anyone who pauses long enough to notice that the food that sustains them is still a gift from forces they do not control. In the quiet of this particular night, with the day behind you and the body settling into its ancient rhythms of rest and renewal, let the oldest version of gratitude find you. Not the elaborated gratitude of the temple ceremony or the harvest festival, but the simple, bodily gratitude of the person who is eaten and is warm and is safe for this night. The gods of the harvest, whatever form they take in your understanding of the world, have cooperated again. The food was there. The body received it. The ancient program is running. And somewhere underneath the modern world, underneath the supply chains and the refrigerated shelves and the long distance between the rain and the meal, the original relationship is still intact. The human body, dependent and grateful, sustained by forces larger than itself, resting in the dark as its ancestors rested, in the ancient and sufficient knowledge that tonight, again, there was enough.
For most of human history, the food you ate was the food your landscape produced. It was bounded by geography in the most absolute sense, by the animals that lived within the range your group could cover, by the plants that grew in the soil and climate of your particular corner of the earth, by the rivers and the seasons, and the limits of what a person on foot could carry from one place to another. The hunter-gatherer's diet was the diet of their watershed, their savanna, their forest. The early farmer's diet was the diet of their valley, their floodplain, their hillside terrace. Food was local, not as a philosophical choice, but as a physical reality, the only reality that had ever existed for the overwhelming majority of human lives. And then, slowly at first, and then with gathering speed, trade began to change this. Goods moved between communities. Rare foods traveled distances their origins would never have predicted, and eventually, through a network of routes that would come to connect the ancient world in ways that no single person fully understood or could have mapped, the spices arrived.
Spices occupy a peculiar position in the history of human food. They are not, strictly speaking, nutritionally necessary. They do not provide the calories or the protein or the fat that the body requires to function. What they provide is something older and in some ways more fundamental to the human relationship with food: flavor, and the transformation of the ordinary into the memorable. A grain porridge is sustenance. A grain porridge with black pepper and coriander and a pinch of something brought from 1,000 miles away is an experience. The willingness of ancient peoples to pay extraordinary prices for substances that added flavor and aroma and preservation to their food, to organize trade routes that stretched from the forests of Southeast Asia to the markets of Rome, from the pepper ports of India's Malabar coast to the spice merchants of Alexandria, is evidence of something important about the human relationship with eating that goes beyond the mere fulfillment of caloric need. The spice trade's origins are older than most people realize. Archaeological evidence of the use of spices in food preparation reaches back thousands of years. Cloves found in a cooking vessel in Syria dating to around 1700 BCE, suggesting their presence in the Near East long before the Classical period. Cinnamon, which grows only in Sri Lanka and parts of Southeast Asia, appears in Egyptian texts from at least 1500 BCE, implying a trade network of remarkable reach for a period when the Mediterranean world's geographic knowledge was by modern standards limited. The mechanisms by which these substances traveled passed between intermediaries, carried by merchants who jealously guarded the secrets of their origins, moving through chains of exchange that spanned multiple cultures and languages and thousands of miles, were among the first truly global systems of commerce that the ancient world produced. Rome was, in its imperial peak, the greatest consumer of spices the ancient world had ever seen. The wealth that flowed through the city generated an appetite for the exotic that the spice trade was uniquely positioned to satisfy. Black pepper, Piper nigrum, grown in the forests of India's southwestern coast, was so valued in Rome that it was stored in the treasury alongside gold and silver. When the Visigoth king Alaric sacked Rome in 410 CE, his ransom demands included, among other things, 3,000 pounds of pepper, a detail that captures better than almost any other the extraordinary value that the ancient world assigned to something that today sits in a small container on every kitchen shelf. The spice routes that carried pepper and cinnamon and ginger and cardamom from their origins in South and Southeast Asia to the markets of the Mediterranean were among the most economically significant infrastructure of the ancient world. But the spice trade was never only about flavor. Spices served practical functions in the ancient world that their role as seasoning today only partially reflects. Many spices have genuine antimicrobial properties, cloves, cinnamon, and black pepper among them, and their use in food preservation was understood empirically long before anyone had a scientific framework for explaining why it worked. In climates where meat spoiled quickly, where the warm months made food storage a constant challenge, where the line between edible and dangerous was often uncomfortably close, the addition of spices to food was not merely a culinary preference. It was a practical strategy for extending the useful life of perishable foods and reducing the risk of consuming something that had begun to turn. The flavor that spices added was real and valued, but so was the safety. The routes that carried spices also carried other things, other foods, other agricultural products, other plants that would eventually transform the diets of entire civilizations. The Silk Road, which connected China to the Mediterranean world across the vast interior of Asia, moved silk and porcelain and paper in one direction, and gold and glassware in the other, but it also moved foods. Grapes traveled east from the Mediterranean into Central Asia. Peaches traveled west from China.
Cotton, sesame, and pomegranates moved through the same networks, gradually expanding the dietary range of every civilization the routes connected. The world was becoming, in this slow and uneven way, a place where the food available to a community was no longer limited to what its own landscape produced. Where a cook in Alexandria might season a dish with pepper from India, sweeten it with honey from Greece, and serve it with wine from a vineyard in what is now France.
For the ordinary person in the ancient world, the farmer in the Nile Delta, the craftsman in a Mesopotamian city, the soldier on the Roman frontier, the spice trade was mostly invisible. The substances it carried were expensive, often beyond the reach of anyone without access to significant wealth. The elaborate flavors of the Roman banquet or the spiced wines of the Hellenistic court were not the daily experience of the people who produced the grain and tended the animals and built the roads along which the spice merchants traveled. The daily diet of the ordinary ancient person remained close to what the local landscape offered: grain in most forms, legumes, whatever vegetables the season produced, occasional meat or fish depending on location and circumstance. The spice trade enriched the diets of the wealthy and gradually, over centuries, diffused downward into broader culinary culture. But for most people, for most of history, the revolution in flavor that the spice routes represented was a distant rumor, glimpsed occasionally in the market and rarely tasted at the table. The psychological significance of the spice trade, however, reached further than its direct culinary impact. It represented something new in the human relationship with food, the beginning of the idea that the limitations of local geography on what you could eat were not permanent, that the world contained foods and flavors beyond what your own landscape produced, and that human ingenuity and enterprise could, at least in principle, bring some of those things within reach. This idea, modest and gradual in its early expression, but transformative in its long-term implications, was one of the threads that eventually led to the globalization of food that the modern world takes entirely for granted. The person who seasons their food today with spices grown on multiple continents is the distant heir of the Roman merchant who paid in silver for Indian pepper, and the Egyptian trader who carried cinnamon from the mysterious lands to the east, and the nameless intermediaries who passed these substances along routes that spanned the ancient world, all of them motivated, at some level, by the oldest and most persistent of human desires, the desire for food that tastes like more than mere survival.
There is something worth pausing on in that desire, the human impulse not just to eat, but to eat well, not just to satisfy the body's need for energy, but to experience the meal as something more than fuel. This impulse is present in the most ancient evidence of human cooking, in the hearths where early humans added aromatic plants to the fire, in the careful selection of the best parts of the animal for immediate consumption, in the social elaboration of the feast that transformed a successful hunt into a communal celebration. The spice trade was, in one sense, the global elaboration of an impulse that had been present in the species since before it had spices to trade. The desire for food that was not merely sufficient but pleasurable, that engaged the senses, that marked the meal as an experience worth having, is one of the most distinctively human features of the human relationship with eating, and it has been present from the beginning.
Let that pleasure rest in you now, gently, as the night deepens and the day's eating recedes into the background of a body at rest. The meal that sustained you today, whatever it was, wherever its ingredients came from, however far they traveled to reach your table, is part of a story that runs from the first fire on the ancient plain to the global networks of the modern world, from the hunter who shared the kill to the spice merchant who crossed a continent for a substance that made food taste like somewhere else. The world made smaller, one trade route at a time, the table made richer, one flavor at a time. and underneath it all, the same ancient body, receiving what the world provides with the same deep gratitude that has always been the human response to a meal that was not just enough, but good. Carry that gratitude into sleep. The spice routes have brought you, by a very long and winding road, to exactly here.
In nearly every religious tradition that humanity has produced, there is a practice that seems, at first glance, to run directly against the grain of everything the body wants. It is not a practice of abundance or celebration or the communal sharing of plenty. It is a practice of deliberate absence, the voluntary withdrawal from food for a period of time, undertaken not because food is unavailable, but because the absence of food is understood to produce something that its presence cannot. The fast, the practice of not eating as a spiritual discipline, a moral statement, a form of prayer, a way of clearing the noise of the body so that something quieter and more essential can be heard. It appears in ancient Egypt and in ancient India, and in the traditions of the Israelites, and in the practices of the early Christian monasteries, and in the Ramadan observance of Islam, and in the vision quests of indigenous North American traditions, and in the ascetic disciplines of Buddhist monks. It appears in some form in virtually every spiritual tradition that has ever developed a sustained practice of interior life. The fast is, in this sense, one of the most universal human religious practices, which raises the question of why. Why did so many different traditions, developing independently in so many different parts of the world, arrived at the conclusion that not eating was a path toward the sacred? The answer, or at least the beginning of an answer, lies in the body's own experience of the fast, in what actually happens, physiologically and psychologically, when a person deliberately withdraws from food for an extended period. In the first hours, the experience is familiar. The ordinary hunger of the gap between meals, the slight restlessness of an appetite that has been denied its expected arrival. But as the hours extend into a day and beyond, something begins to shift. The preoccupation with food that normally occupies a significant portion of daily attention begins, paradoxically, to quiet. The metabolic transition from glucose-based energy to fat-based energy proceeds. The brain, receiving ketone bodies as an alternative fuel, often enters a state of unusual clarity, a sharpened, simplified alertness that the people who experience it frequently describe as unlike ordinary wakefulness. The body, no longer engaged in the constant work of digestion and metabolic response to incoming food, redirects its attention inward. And the person fasting finds themselves in a state of consciousness that the ordinary fed, distracted life rarely produces.
The ancient Egyptians practiced fasting as part of their preparation for sacred rituals. The priests who served in the temples observed periods of dietary restriction before approaching the divine precincts, the purity of the body considered a prerequisite for contact with the sacred. In the Hebrew Bible, fasting accompanies the most serious moments of communal and individual encounter with the divine. Moses fasting 40 days on Sinai, the Israelites fasting in response to national crisis, the Day of Atonement established as an annual fast through which the community sought collective purification. The 40-day fast appears again in the Christian tradition in the account of Jesus in the wilderness, a period of deprivation and spiritual intensification that preceded his public ministry. The number 40 recurring across these traditions is not coincidental. It is long enough for the body's metabolic transition to be fully established, long enough for the psychological shift that the fast produces to become thoroughgoing, long enough for the ordinary preoccupations of the fed life to have been stripped away and something more fundamental to become visible.
In the Indian traditions, both Hindu and Buddhist, the relationship between fasting and spiritual development was theorized with particular sophistication. The concept of tapas in the Hindu tradition
often translated as austerity or heat, encompasses a range of ascetic practices, of which fasting is among the most important. The practitioner who undertakes tapas is understood to be generating a form of spiritual energy through the discipline of self-denial, burning away impurities, strengthening the will, cultivating the capacity for sustained attention that the spiritual life requires. The Buddha famously practiced extreme asceticism, including severe fasting, early in his spiritual career, before concluding that the middle way, neither extreme indulgence nor extreme deprivation, was the path that led most reliably toward enlightenment. But even in the moderated form that Buddhism eventually endorsed, periods of dietary restriction remained a central feature of monastic practice, the monks eating only before noon, the afternoon and evening hours left free from the work of digestion and the hunger that follows eating.
The Islamic practice of Ramadan, the month-long daily fast from dawn to sunset that is one of the 5 pillars of the faith, is perhaps the most widely observed religious fast in the world today, observed by more than 1 billion people annually. Its structure is distinctive among the world's fasting traditions in its communal character, not a solitary spiritual discipline, but a collective one, the entire community fasting together. The shared experience of hunger through the daylight hours creates a bond of solidarity that the breaking of the fast at sunset, the iftar meal, shared with family and community, reinforces and celebrates. The fast of Ramadan is simultaneously an individual spiritual practice and a social event, the hunger of the day creating a heightened appreciation for the food of the evening, the deprivation of the individual transforming the communal meal into something more charged and more meaningful than the ordinary dinner that it structurally resembles. What all of these traditions share, beneath their theological differences, is a practical wisdom about the relationship between the body's experience of hunger and the quality of attention available to the person experiencing it. The fed body is a busybody, occupied with digestion, with the hormonal responses to incoming food, with the comfortable, slightly diffuse satisfaction of a system running at full supply. The fasting body is a different kind of instrument, quieter in some respects, more alert in others, stripped of the constant low-level preoccupation with food that characterizes ordinary waking life, and left in a state of simplified, clarified attention that many practitioners describe as closer to the quality of awareness they are seeking in their spiritual practice. This is not mysticism, it is physiology, the documented experience of a body running on ketones rather than glucose, in a metabolic state that the ancient hunter-gatherer body occupied regularly and that the modern body rarely visits. The fast also carries a social and moral dimension that transcends its physiological effects. To fast voluntarily, to choose hunger in a context where food is available, is to perform a kind of solidarity with those for whom hunger is not a choice. The religious traditions that practice fasting frequently make this connection explicit. The food not eaten during the fast to be given to those who are hungry, the experience of voluntary deprivation intended to create empathy with the involuntary deprivation of others. The fast of the wealthy person who chooses not to eat is connected in this moral framework to the hunger of the poor person who cannot eat, the chosen discomfort of the one a small bridge across the vast distance between sufficiency and scarcity. Whether this bridge is effective in generating genuine empathy is a question that different traditions and different practitioners have answered differently, but the intention, the use of voluntary hunger as a tool for moral imagination, is itself a form of wisdom about the social meaning of food. There is a particular quality to the breaking of a fast that has no equivalent in ordinary eating. The meal that ends a significant period of voluntary hunger is experienced with an intensity and a gratitude that the ordinary meal, however good, cannot match, because the fast has done what it was designed to do, which is to restore to the person fasting the full weight of what food actually is. The iftar meal after a day of Ramadan fasting, the Easter feast after 40 days of Lenten discipline, the food that the vision-questing warrior returned to after days in the wilderness without eating.
These meals are not simply the resumption of normal feeding. They are arrivals, moments of return to something that the fast had made strange and then made precious again. The body receiving food after the fast receives it with the whole depth of its ancient gratitude, the gratitude of the species that evolved in uncertainty, for whom the meal was never guaranteed and therefore never taken for granted.
The long fast, practiced deliberately and with spiritual intention, is in some sense a voluntary return to the condition of the ancient body, the body before the guarantee of daily eating, the body that the hunter-gatherer inhabited as a matter of course, and that the agricultural revolution progressively replaced with something more predictable and more comfortable. The person who fasts for 40 days in the wilderness is, on one level, undergoing an extreme version of what early humans underwent as a structural feature of their existence: the metabolic transition, the psychological clarification, the deepened relationship with the body's own capacity for endurance. The religious traditions that valorize this experience are, in this sense, preserving a wisdom about the human body that the comfort of the modern world has largely made unnecessary, the wisdom that the body is more capable and more adaptable than the fed, comfortable life allows it to demonstrate, and that the encounter with its own capacity for endurance produces something in the person who undergoes it that abundance cannot replicate. As you lie in the quiet of this late hour, your own body is in the early stages of its nightly fast, the small, gentle version of the ancient practice that every sleeping body undergoes, every night as a matter of biological course. The digestive work of the day is winding down. The metabolic transition is beginning, quietly and without drama, the same transition that the religious faster experiences in its more deliberate and extended form. Your body, in the dark, is doing what it has always done, finding its way to the deeper resources, the longer reserves, the ancient capacity for sustaining itself through the hours of absence. This is the nightly fast, the gentle version, the one that asks nothing of you but the surrender of consciousness into sleep. Let it take you. The body knows the way. It has been making this journey every night of your life, as it made it every night of every life before yours, all the way back to the first dark and the first fire, and the first person who closed their eyes and trusted the ancient program to carry them through.
There is a theory in paleoanthropology that is not universally accepted, but that has gathered enough evidence around it to be taken seriously. The idea that cooking, more than any other single development in the long story of the human species, is what made us human. Not tools, though tools came first. Not language, though language transformed everything. Not the social complexity of the group, though that was essential. Cooking, the application of fire to food, the transformation of raw calories into something more digestible, more energy-dense, more available to the brain, may have been the pivotal event that allowed the human body to become what it is. The large brain that makes language and tools and social complexity possible is an extraordinarily expensive organ, consuming roughly 20% of the body's resting energy in a body that accounts for only 2% of its mass. Something had to make that energy available, and the evidence, when you follow it carefully, points toward the fire. The argument, developed most thoroughly by the primatologist Richard Wrangham in his work on the cooking hypothesis, runs roughly as follows. Raw food, even raw meat, even raw tubers and roots, yield significantly less usable energy than the same food cooked. Cooking breaks down the cellular structures of plants and denatures the proteins of meat, making the calories within them far more accessible to digestion. A chimpanzee eating raw food spends a very large proportion of its waking hours simply chewing, the mechanical processing of tough, fibrous, resistant material that the gut then has to work hard to extract nutrition from. Early hominins eating raw food faced the same constraint. The shift to cooked food, which archaeological evidence suggests may have begun as early as 1 to 2 million years ago, long before Homo sapiens, would have dramatically increased the caloric return from the same quantity of food, freeing up both the time previously spent chewing and the digestive energy previously spent processing raw material. The physical evidence in the human body for this shift is visible in the skeleton itself. Compared to our closest primate relatives, modern humans have smaller teeth, smaller jaws, smaller digestive tracts, and larger brains. All of these features are consistent with a long adaptation to cooked food, a diet that requires less mechanical processing, delivers more usable energy per unit consumed, and over many generations relaxes the selection pressure for the large grinding teeth and powerful jaw muscles that raw food-eating primates require. The human gut, shorter and less elaborate than the guts of other great apes, is not well suited to extracting nutrition from large quantities of raw plant material. It is well suited to processing food that has already been partially broken down by heat. The body, in this sense, bears the physical record of the cooking fire in its own architecture, shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of eating food that the fire had transformed.
What cooking did to food, it also did indirectly to the social life of the species. The fire around which cooked food was prepared and shared became the center of the human social world in a way that has no parallel among other primates. The hearth, the controlled fire used for cooking, created a fixed location that the group returned to, a place that was warmer and safer and more social than the surrounding landscape. It extended the productive hours of the day beyond the setting of the sun, creating the fire-lit evening as a distinctly human social space. It required cooperation, the gathering of fuel, the tending of the flame, the preparation of food, that reinforced the social bonds of the group and created shared routines that gave the day a structure it had not previously possessed. The cooking fire was not just a technology for transforming food. It was the architecture of the human social world, the original gathering place around which the species learned to be human together.
The foods that cooking made available were not only more digestible, but more varied. Many plants that are toxic or inedible in their raw form become safe and nutritious when cooked. The complex carbohydrates of roots and tubers that the raw gut cannot efficiently process become accessible. The toxins in certain legumes are denatured by heat. The tough connective tissues of meat become tender and digestible. Cooking effectively expanded the range of edible foods available to early humans, allowing them to extract nutrition from sources that would have been unavailable or dangerous to eat raw. In this sense, cooking was a form of environmental engineering, the transformation of the landscape's nutritional potential through the application of fire, making available to the human diet a range of foods that the uncooked landscape could not have provided. The relationship between food and the development of the human brain is one of the most fascinating threads in the whole story of what food made us. The brain's extraordinary energy demands, its requirement for a steady supply of glucose and other nutrients, its particular need for the long-chain fatty acids that are concentrated in animal foods, place constraints on the diet that could support its development. Brains of the size and complexity that characterize modern Homo sapiens could not have developed or been maintained on the kind of low-quality, high-fiber, low-calorie diet that supports the lives of other great apes. The shift toward a diet that included more animal foods, more cooked foods, and more energy-dense calories was not just a dietary preference, it was a physiological prerequisite for the kind of brain that eventually produced language and art and music, and the questions that lead, among other things, to the telling of stories like this one in the dark. There is a particular food in the story of human brain development that deserves its own moment of attention: fat. The human brain is approximately 60% fat by dry weight, and the specific types of fat it requires The omega-3 fatty acids, particularly DHA, that are concentrated in seafood and certain animal foods, are not easily synthesized by the body and must be obtained from the diet. The presence of shellfish and fish remains at many early Homo sapiens sites, sometimes in remarkable quantities, has led some researchers to propose that access to coastal and lakeside resources rich in these specific fats may have played a significant role in the cognitive development of the species. The brain that is telling this story, and the brain that is listening to it tonight, may owe something of its capacity to the ancient human habit of eating at the water's edge, cracking open shellfish on flat rocks, pulling fish from shallow coastal waters, accessing the specific nutritional building blocks that the brain's extraordinary development required.
Food also made us culturally. The cuisines that different human groups developed, the specific combinations of ingredients, the particular techniques of preparation, the flavor profiles that became characteristic of particular places and peoples are among the most durable and most deeply felt markers of cultural identity. The food a person grew up eating is connected to memory and belonging in ways that few other cultural practices can match, because food enters the body, because it was present at every family gathering and every celebration and every ordinary evening of a childhood, because its flavors and smells are encoded in the memory with a directness and an emotional resonance that the other arts rarely achieve. The cuisine of a culture is its autobiography, the accumulated record of what was available in its landscape, what it traded for and borrowed from its neighbors, what it celebrated and what it mourned, written not in words, but in the flavors that its members carry in their bodies as the most intimate form of cultural knowledge.
And food made us politically. The control of food, the ownership of agricultural land, the management of granaries, the taxation of harvests, the ability to feed armies and deny food to enemies, has been among the primary instruments of political power in every complex society that has ever existed. Civilizations rose on the foundation of agricultural surplus, and they fell, often, when that surplus failed, or was seized, or was disrupted by the movement of peoples and the collapse of the networks that distributed it. The political history of the ancient world is, in very large part, a history of the control of food: who had it, who needed it, who could withhold it, and what the people who were hungry were willing to do to the people who stood between them and eating. The wars and the empires and the revolutions and the famines that punctuate the historical record are all, underneath their political and military surfaces, stories about food, about the oldest and most fundamental of human needs, and the power that accrues to those who control its provision.
As the night carries you toward its deepest hours, let the full weight of what food has made rest gently in your awareness. Not as a burden, but as a context, the quiet recognition that the body you inhabit, and the mind that is listening, and the culture that shaped the language of this story, and the social world that formed the person you are, all of it, in ways too numerous and too deep to fully trace, was made by food, by the ancient decision to apply fire to raw material and see what became possible, by the sharing of what the fire produced around the hearth that became the center of the social world, by the brain that the cooked diet helped build, and the questions that brain eventually learned to ask, and the stories it eventually learned to tell in the dark, to people lying in the quiet, in the ancient and reliable company of their own bodies, being carried through the night by the same metabolic wisdom that has always, in the end, been enough. Sleep well. You are, in the most literal sense, made of what you have eaten, and what you have eaten, across the full length of human history, has made you extraordinary.
There is a food so fundamental to the story of human civilization that it has become, in the languages and religions and metaphors of dozens of cultures, a synonym for food itself. Not meat, though meat was older, not fruit, though fruit was sweeter, not the rich and varied diet of the hunter-gatherer, though that diet was in many respects more nutritious. Bread. The transformation of grain into a baked, portable, storable, shareable food that could be produced in reliable quantities and distributed across a community, this single culinary achievement underpins more of human history than almost any other. Armies marched on it. Cities were built around the infrastructure required to produce it. The phrase daily bread entered the languages of people who had never heard of each other, because the daily bread was, for most of settled human history, the closest thing to a guaranteed meal that most people would ever know. To understand what bread meant to the ancient world is to understand something essential about what the agricultural revolution actually delivered. Not abundance exactly, but the particular and precious thing that turned out to matter more than abundance: reliability. The path from wild grass to bread was long and did not happen in a single deliberate step. It began somewhere in the highlands of the Fertile Crescent, around 11 or 12,000 years ago, with the gradual selection of wild wheat and barley varieties, whose seeds clung to the stalk rather than falling freely to the ground. A subtle genetic difference that made harvesting far more efficient for the humans who had begun to deliberately collect these grasses. Over many generations, the plants that produced the most seed, that were most reliably productive, that grew most cooperatively in proximity to human settlements, were the ones whose seeds were replanted. Not through any formal understanding of genetics, that understanding was still 10,000 years away, but through the accumulated practical wisdom of people who noticed what worked and did more of it. The plant and the human were co-evolving, each shaping the other across the slow centuries of early agriculture, until the wheat that grew in the first fields of the Fertile Crescent bore only a passing resemblance to the wild grass from which it had descended.
The processing of grain into bread required a chain of technologies that represented collectively one of the first complex industrial processes in human history. The grain had to be harvested, which required cutting tools. The sickle, one of the most ancient of agricultural implements, its flint blades sometimes still found in archaeological sites, with the characteristic polish of grain cutting preserved on their edges. The grain then had to be threshed, separating the edible seed from the stalk and the chaff, a process that required specific techniques and specific spaces. The threshing floor, a hard, flat surface, often elevated to catch the wind, where the grain was beaten and tossed until the lighter chaff blew away and the heavier seeds remained. The grain then had to be stored, milled into flour, mixed with water, and baked, each step requiring its own technology, its own skill, its own infrastructure. Bread was not a simple food. It was the product of a complex and coordinated system, and the communities that developed and maintained that system organized significant portions of their social life around it.
The earliest breads were not the risen, yeast-leavened loaves that the word brings to mind today. They were flat, unleavened rounds of ground grain mixed with water and baked on hot stones or in clay ovens, dense and filling and far more nutritious than they might appear to modern eyes, accustomed to the refined flour products of industrial baking. The flatbread is one of the oldest and most persistent foods in the human repertoire, still made in recognizable forms across the Middle East, South Asia, and North Africa today, connecting the people who eat it to a tradition of grain processing that stretches back to the earliest agricultural settlements. The transition to leavened bread, bread raised by the activity of wild yeasts, lighter and more complex in flavor, appears to have developed in ancient Egypt, possibly by accident, possibly through observation of what happened to grain dough left to sit before baking. The Egyptians became the master bakers of the ancient world, producing dozens of varieties of bread for different social purposes, and the yeast that raised their loaves is the ancestor of the yeast that has been raising bread ever since. In ancient Egypt, bread was so central to daily life that it functioned in many contexts as a form of currency. Workers who built the pyramids and the temples were paid partly in bread and beer, their daily rations carefully recorded in administrative papyri that have survived to tell the story of the most basic transaction in the ancient Egyptian economy. The ration was not merely wages, it was the guarantee of survival, the state's commitment to feed the people who labored for it, expressed in the daily delivery of loaves to the workers' settlements at Giza and Saqqara and the Valley of the Kings. The pyramid builders were not slaves, as popular imagination has long supposed. They were workers, skilled, fed, organized, sustained by the bread that the state's agricultural infrastructure produced in the quantities that the monumental ambitions of the pharaohs required. The pyramid and the bread that fed its builders are, in this sense, the same achievement, both expressions of what a society organized around the reliable production and distribution of grain could accomplish.
In ancient Mesopotamia, the administration of grain and bread was among the most important functions of the temple and the palace. The great storage facilities of Mesopotamian cities held grain in quantities sufficient to sustain the urban population through the months between harvests and to buffer the community against the failure of any single season's crop. The redistribution of this grain, as rations to workers, as offerings to the gods, as loans to farmers who had lost their seed grain to drought or flood, was one of the primary functions of the bureaucratic apparatus that Mesopotamian civilization developed. The cuneiform writing system that is among the earliest in the world was developed in significant part to keep track of grain, who had deposited how much, who had received how much, what was owed, and what had been paid. The world's first writing, in a very real sense, a technology for managing bread.
The cultural and religious significance of bread extended far beyond its practical importance as a food. In the Hebrew tradition, the unleavened bread of Passover, the matzah, eaten to commemorate the hasty departure from Egypt when there was no time to let the bread rise, carries the memory of liberation and the theological weight of a people's founding story in the form of food. In the Christian tradition, the bread of the Eucharist, the consecrated wafer that is, in Catholic theology, the actual body of Christ, places bread at the absolute center of the religion's most sacred ritual, transforming the most ordinary and universal of foods into the vehicle for the most extraordinary of theological claims. Bread, in these traditions, is not simply nourishment. It is the substance in which the sacred and the everyday most completely overlap, the food that sustains the body, and, in its ritual form, is understood to sustain something more than the body. The distribution of bread in the ancient and medieval city was a political act as much as a practical one. The Roman practice of providing free grain, and eventually free bread, to the citizens of the capital was not simply a welfare measure, it was a political instrument, the state's most direct expression of its obligation to feed its people, and its most reliable mechanism for maintaining the loyalty of the urban population. The phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses, captures the Roman political understanding of what the population required to remain quiescent: food and entertainment, the body satisfied and the attention occupied. When the bread supply failed in Rome, when the grain ships from Egypt were delayed, when the warehouses ran low, the political consequences were immediate and sometimes violent. The mob that was fed was a mob that could be managed. The mob that was hungry was a mob that was dangerous. The politics of bread in Rome were the politics of survival, and every emperor understood that the management of the grain supply was among the most critical of his responsibilities. The bread that moved through ancient and medieval cities carried with it the entire social geography of the civilization that produced it. The finest white bread, made from the most carefully milled flour with the smallest quantity of bran, was the bread of the wealthy, light, pale, expensive, its refinement a direct expression of the social distance between the table it was served at and the fields where the grain was grown. The darker, denser, coarser breads, made from less thoroughly processed grain, or from cheaper grains like rye and millet, were the bread of the laboring classes, More nutritious as it happens, but understood socially as inferior, the food of people who could not afford the luxury of white flour. The hierarchy of bread mapped the hierarchy of society with a directness that the people who ate it would have understood immediately, and it persisted, in various forms, across the entire span of pre-industrial civilization, the color and texture of your bread telling any observer exactly where you stood in the social order. Let the image of bread rest with you as you move towards sleep. Not the elaborate bread of the modern bakery, but the simpler thing, the flat round baked on a hot stone, the dense dark loaf from a clay oven, the food that was payment and prayer and politics, and the daily assurance that the grain had come in, and the oven was hot, and the community had made it through another season of the long, uncertain relationship between the rain and the hardest, and the hunger that waited always at the margin of the agricultural world. Bread was what civilization made of wheat, and wheat was what civilization made of the ancient human need to eat without wondering every day whether there would be enough. Tonight the bread is baked, the stores are full, the ancient anxiety is quiet, and the body that was built for uncertainty is resting, as it always eventually rests, in the sufficient warmth of the present moment, full and warm, and carried through the dark by the oldest and most reliable of its inheritances. At some point in the long story of human eating, the act of consuming food acquired a piece of furniture. Not immediately. For most of the span of human existence, food was eaten without tables, without chairs, without the organized domestic space that the word dining implies. It was eaten on the ground, around the fire, in the postures of people who had not yet developed the concept of a dedicated eating surface. But as human settlements became more permanent, as the domestic space became more elaborated, as the social meanings attached to eating became more complex and more carefully managed, the table emerged, and with it, a whole architecture of social meaning that transformed the simple act of putting food into the body into one of the most richly coded performances in the repertoire of human social life. The table is where food became civilization's most intimate theater. The earliest evidence of dedicated eating furniture is modest and practical. Flat stones arranged near hearths, low clay platforms in ancient Near Eastern domestic spaces, the simple organizational logic of a surface that separates food from the ground and creates a shared focal point for the group assembled to eat. But even in these earliest forms, the table carried social implications beyond its practical function. Who sat closest to the food? Who was served first? Who was present at the table at all? Because the table, from very early in its social history, was not simply a place where food was consumed. It was a place where membership in a group was enacted and confirmed. To be invited to someone's table was to be recognized as belonging. To be excluded from it was one of the oldest and most legible forms of social rejection. The table drew a circle, and the circle had an inside and an outside, and the food served within it was not simply nourishment, it was the material expression of who mattered. In the great civilizations of the ancient world, the table of the powerful became one of the most elaborately managed social spaces in the entire culture. The banquet of the Assyrian king Ashur-nasir-pal II, held to celebrate the completion of his new capital city at Nimrud around 879 BCE, was recorded in a royal inscription that lists the guests and the quantities of food served with an administrative precision that reflects how seriously the event was taken. Nearly 70,000 guests fed over 10 days, the quantities of meat and bread and beer and wine listed with the same care that military campaigns and territorial conquests received in the royal record.
The feast was not incidental to the king's power. It was an expression of it. The ability to feed tens of thousands, a direct demonstration of the resources the king controlled and his willingness to deploy them in the service of his political relationships. In ancient Greece, the symposium, literally the drinking together, was one of the central institutions of aristocratic social life. It was not primarily a meal, though food was present. It was a structured social occasion, organized around the shared consumption of wine, diluted with water in ratios that were themselves a matter of social agreement, accompanied by conversation and music and the performance of poetry and the discussion of philosophy. The symposium was where the intellectual and political life of the Greek city-state was conducted in its most informal and most influential form, where alliances were made and ideas were tested, and reputations were built and destroyed in the intimate, wine-loosened atmosphere of the shared table. Plato's Symposium, one of the foundational texts of Western philosophy, is set at exactly such an occasion, the great question of the nature of love debated around a table by men who have eaten together and are now drinking together in the fire-lit room of a private house in Athens.
The Roman dining room, the triclinium, named for the three couches around the low central table on which guests reclined while eating, was a space whose layout encoded the social hierarchy of the Roman world with architectural precision. The placement of each guest on the three couches followed a strict protocol of social rank, the most honored position known, the position of least distinction equally well understood, the entire geometry of the room a physical map of the relative status of everyone present. The food served at Roman dinner parties varied by the host's wealth and social ambition, but the social performance of the dinner was as carefully managed as the food itself. The conversation, the entertainment, the order of courses, the quality of the wine offered to different guests, all of it a continuous negotiation of social position conducted in the language of the table. To dine with someone in Rome was to be located precisely in the social world, and every element of the meal communicated that location.
The table of the medieval European castle carried a different but equally elaborate social grammar. The great hall, the large central room of the medieval castle or manor house, was where lord and household ate together, the arrangement of the space communicating the social order of the feudal world as clearly as any written document. The high table, elevated on a dais at one end of the hall, was where the lord and his most honored guests sat, consuming the finest food, served in the most elaborate vessels, waited upon by the most senior members of the household staff. The lower tables, stretching down the hall toward the door, seated the household members in strict order of rank. The social geography of the meal literally mapped onto the geography of the room. The distance from the high table, a precise measure of your distance from power. The salt cellar, placed at a specific point on the high table, was the dividing line between the honored and the less honored. To be seated above the salt or below it was a social fact that every person in the hall understood and that no one present needed to explain. But the table was not only the theater of power and hierarchy, it was also, simultaneously, the space of the most intimate human connection, the family meal, the gathering of the people who mattered most to each other around the food that sustained them, the daily renewal of the bonds that held the household together. In cultures across the world and across history, the shared family meal has carried a weight of meaning that transcends its practical function. The expectation that the family will eat together, that the table will be the place where the day's events are shared and the relationships of the household are tended, is so widespread and so persistent that it appears to reflect something fundamental about the human need to combine the physical act of eating with the social act of belonging. The family that eats together is not simply more efficient at feeding its members. It is, in some way, that people across cultures have recognized without always being able to articulate, more fully itself.
The foods placed on the table throughout history carried meanings that went far beyond their nutritional content. The roasted meat at the center of the medieval feast was not simply protein, it was the display of the Lord's wealth and hunting rights, the evidence of his mastery over the animals of his territory. The elaborate sugar sculptures that decorated the tables of Renaissance banquets were not simply dessert, they were demonstrations of the host's access to luxury ingredients and the skill of the craftspeople in his employ, edible architecture that announced wealth and taste in the same gesture. The plain bread and water of the monastic table was not simply austere nutrition, it was a theological statement, the deliberate rejection of the table's potential for display in favor of the simplest possible acknowledgement that the body's needs were to be met without celebration. Every table throughout history has been a text, readable by the people seated around it, communicating in the language of food the values and the social position and the intentions of the people who set it. The table endures. In a world where the act of eating has been disaggregated in almost every other respect, where food is available at any hour, consumed in transit, eaten alone in front of screens, delivered to the door in containers designed for individual consumption, the table persists as the space where the oldest social meaning of eating is still regularly enacted. The family dinner, the dinner party, the holiday feast, the restaurant meal shared between friends, all of these are continuations, however attenuated, of the ancient social logic of the shared table. The people who gather around it are, without necessarily knowing it, participating in a practice that reaches back to the first flat stone arranged near the first hearth, when the act of eating together first began to acquire the social weight that it has carried, in one form or another, through every human culture ever since. As you settle into the deepest quiet of the night, let the table rest gently in your awareness, not as furniture, but as a symbol, the enduring human shape of the belief that eating is not only a private act, but a social one, that the food that sustains the body also, when shared, sustains something between people that nothing else quite reaches. The table is where the species has always gathered to do what it has always done, to eat, and in eating together, to be, briefly and fully, the social animal that 200,000 years of living in groups has made it. The feast is over for tonight. The table is cleared. The household is settling into the warm, full quiet of the late hour. And the ancient social contract of the shared meal, the one that began around the first fire on the open ground, and that the table has been enacting ever since, is resting, as all good things rest, in the sufficiency of what has already been given. There is a threshold in the history of human food that is so recent, so sudden in the context of the full span of the species' existence, and so total in its transformation of the ancient relationship between the human body and hunger, that it is difficult to see clearly from inside it, the way it is difficult to see the shape of the landscape you are standing in the middle of. The threshold is the last 2 centuries, and more particularly the last 100 years, and most particularly the last 50, the period in which the combination of industrial agriculture, synthetic fertilizers, mechanized harvesting, refrigeration, global supply chains, and the entire infrastructure of the modern food system produced something that no human society in the previous 200,000 years had ever possessed: the reliable expectation for a significant and growing portion of the world's population that food would be available in sufficient quantity at any hour of any day, regardless of season, regardless of geography, regardless of whether the rain had come or the harvest had succeeded, or the hunt had returned with anything at all. The age of plenty arrived so recently that the oldest people alive today were born before it was fully established, and the body that is navigating it was built for something entirely different. The transformation began, in its industrial phase, with a series of agricultural revolutions that compounded across the 19th and 20th centuries in ways that their individual contributors could not have anticipated. The development of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers in the early 20th century, the Haber-Bosch process, which allowed nitrogen from the atmosphere to be fixed into a form that plants could use, was perhaps the single most consequential agricultural innovation in human history, making possible the yield increases that allowed the global population to grow from roughly 1.5 billion people in 1900 to 8 billion today. Without synthetic fertilizer, the soils of the world could not have supported the population that now depends on them. The green revolution of the mid-20th century, the development of high-yield crop varieties, the expansion of irrigation, the application of pesticides and herbicides at agricultural scale, compounded these gains, dramatically increasing the caloric output of the world's farmland and driving down the real cost of food across the second half of the 20th century in ways that had no precedent in all of agricultural history. Refrigeration was the technology that changed the daily experience of food more directly and more intimately than perhaps any other. Before mechanical refrigeration, which became widely available in American and European homes only in the 20th century, the management of food at the household level was a constant, skilled, time-consuming activity. Food spoiled. Meat had to be consumed quickly or preserved through salt, smoke, or fermentation. Dairy products were perishable over hours in warm weather. The seasonal availability of fresh produce was absolute. You ate what was growing now, in your region, and preserved what you could for the months when nothing grew. The refrigerator dissolved all of this. It extended the useful life of virtually every perishable food, made the management of household food supply dramatically less demanding, and, combined with the global supply chains that could now move refrigerated goods across continents, effectively abolished the seasonal and geographic constraints on what was available to eat at any given moment. The supermarket was the retail expression of this transformation, the space in which the full achievement of the modern food system became visible to the ordinary consumer. The first true supermarkets appeared in the United States in the 1930s, and by the second half of the 20th century had become the dominant form of food retail across the developed world. They offered something that no previous retail food environment had ever offered: the simultaneous presence in a single temperature-controlled space of foods from every season and every geography, available in quantities and at prices that would have been literally inconceivable to any previous generation of humans. The strawberry available in January, the orange available in July, the fresh fish available 2,000 miles from the nearest ocean, the meat in portions and forms that required no knowledge of butchery to use. The supermarket was the physical manifestation of the age of plenty, the built environment of a world in which the ancient relationship between season and diet, between geography and available food, had been effectively dissolved. The body that walked into this environment for the first time, the body that had been shaped across 200,000 years of irregular eating, seasonal scarcity, and the constant metabolic management of uncertainty, brought with it all of its ancient programming into a world that ancient programming had not been designed for. The preference for energy-dense foods, fats and sugars and starches that had been adaptive in a world where such foods were rare and valuable, became a liability in a world where they were available in unlimited quantities at low cost. The tendency to eat beyond immediate need when caloric density was high, to take advantage of abundance while it lasted, because abundance had never lasted, produced different outcomes when abundance was permanent rather than episodic. The metabolic conservatism that had protected early humans through lean seasons became, in conditions of continuous surplus, a system running a program that the environment no longer required. The diseases of plenty, obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, the cluster of metabolic conditions that have risen dramatically in prevalence across the second half of the 20th century are in significant part the expression of this mismatch. They are not failures of individual willpower or lapses of personal virtue, though they are often discussed in those terms. They are the predictable consequences of an ancient biological system encountering an environment it was not designed for, a body built for scarcity, navigating abundance, a metabolism calibrated for oscillation, running in conditions of near constant surplus, a set of ancient appetites receiving signals of unlimited availability that they were not equipped to properly interpret. The body is doing exactly what it was designed to do. The design simply does not match the world it now inhabits. And yet, the age of plenty has also delivered something that it would be wrong to minimize: the effective elimination, for the populations that have access to it, of the ancient fear that was the constant companion of the agricultural world, the fear of the failed harvest, the fear of the empty granary, the fear of the lean season stretching beyond the reserves available to meet it, the fear that the rain would not come, or would come too much, or would come at the wrong time, and that the calculation on which the season's survival depended would fail. This fear, ancient, persistent, woven into the social and religious life of every agricultural civilization, has been, for the people who live within the modern food system, effectively silenced. Not perfectly and not universally. Hunger persists, food insecurity persists. The distribution of the age of plenty remains radically unequal across the world's population. But for the significant portion of humanity that has access to the modern food system in its full form, the ancient existential anxiety about whether there would be enough has been answered, at least provisionally, in the affirmative. There will be enough. The question that every human civilization before this one had to hold with genuine uncertainty has been, within limits, resolved. What the resolution of that question has revealed, however, is that the human relationship with food was never only about the satisfaction of biological need. The rituals around eating, the feast and the fast, the shared table and the harvest festival, the prayer before the meal and the offering to the harvest god, were not simply responses to scarcity. They were expressions of something deeper in the human relationship with food. The recognition that eating is one of the most fundamental ways the human body participates in the world, that the transformation of the world's substance into the body's substance is an act charged with meaning, that the satisfaction of hunger alone does not exhaust. In the age of plenty, when hunger is no longer the organizing anxiety of daily life, these meanings do not disappear. They search for new forms. In the contemporary interest in food culture, in the elaboration of cuisine as an art form, in the remarkable persistence of food-centered religious and cultural rituals, even among populations for whom the practical significance of those rituals has been substantially reduced. The human need to invest eating with meaning is not a product of scarcity. It is a feature of the species. The age of plenty has also produced, in the cultures that have lived within it long enough, a complicated nostalgia for what it replaced, a longing, imprecise but persistent, for the older relationship with food. The farm-to-table movement, the celebration of seasonal and local eating, the interest in traditional food cultures and artisanal production methods, the practice of fasting as a deliberate choice in a world where fasting is no longer a necessity, all of these are, in their various ways, expressions of the sense that something was present in the ancient relationship with food that the age of plenty has not entirely replaced. Something about the meaning of effort and uncertainty and seasonal constraint and the earned quality of a meal that came from a difficult day.
something about the social weight of shared scarcity and the particular depth of gratitude that the relief of hunger produces in a body that has genuinely felt it. The age of plenty has given abundantly. What it has made harder to access is the full emotional register of what it means to eat, the depth of feeling that is available only to a body that knows, in the cells of its ancient memory, what the alternative is.
As you lie in the profound quiet of this late hour, the age of plenty is present around you in all its invisible infrastructure: the food and refrigerator, the supply chains that stocked the shelves, the agricultural systems that produced the ingredients, the long and remarkable chain of human ingenuity and industrial organization that has made this moment of sufficiency possible. None of it is audible. None of it is visible in the dark, but it is there, as the ancient program is also there, the body running its old metabolic rhythms in the new context, the hunger that is managed but not abolished, the gratitude that is available if you reach for it, the memory of scarcity that lives in every cell of a body shaped by 200,000 years of uncertainty. Both things are true tonight. The plenty is real, and the ancient hunger that makes plenty meaningful, the hunger that the body carries as its oldest inheritance, is real too. Between them, held in the quiet of the sleeping body, is the whole story of what food has been to the species that needed it most and understood it best. Rest now, inside all of it.
There is a kind of memory that does not live in the mind. It does not reside in the hippocampus or the prefrontal cortex, does not require language to hold it, cannot be retrieved by the ordinary act of recollection that brings back a face or a name, or the events of a particular afternoon. It lives instead in the body itself, in the architecture of the metabolism, in the sensitivity of the hormonal system, in the particular ways the body responds to the presence and absence of food that were written into its design across hundreds of thousands of years of living in conditions that no longer exist. This is cellular memory, not a metaphor, but a biological reality. The body remembers what the mind has never known, and every human body alive today carries within it the accumulated memory of every lean season and every uncertain hunt, and every long night between meals that the species has ever navigated. That memory is not accessible to conscious recollection, but it is present, quietly and continuously, in everything the body does.
You can feel it if you know where to look. It is present in the particular quality of pleasure that a very good meal produces, the depth of satisfaction that goes beyond the simple relief of hunger into something that feels almost like gratitude, a response calibrated not just to the present meal, but to the long history of meals that were not guaranteed. It is present in the slight anxiety that some people feel when the refrigerator is running low, an unease that the rational mind recognizes as disproportionate to any actual threat, but that the body generates anyway, from the ancient memory of what low supplies have historically meant. It is present in the way that the smell of certain foods, bread baking, meat roasting, the particular sweetness of ripe fruit, can produce an immediate and almost physical response of anticipation and pleasure that seems to bypass the thinking mind entirely and arrive directly in the body as something older and more urgent than ordinary appetite. The evolutionary psychologists call this biophilia when it refers to the human affinity for certain landscapes, the preference for environments that would have been productive and safe for early humans, encoded in aesthetic responses that persist long after the practical reasons for them have disappeared. The same logic applies to food. The human preference for sweet tastes reflects the ancestral value of ripe fruit as a reliable source of calories and micronutrients. The craving for fat reflects the ancestral scarcity of energy-dense foods and the body's understanding that fat, when available, should be consumed and stored. The particular appeal of salt reflects the genuine rarity of dietary sodium in many ancestral environments and the body's need for it in quantities that the natural diet did not always reliably provide. These preferences are not learned, they are inherited, the body's memory of what mattered, expressed in the language of appetite and craving, and the pleasure of eating things that the ancestral environment made valuable and rare. The body's memory of scarcity is also present in the way that hunger feels, in the specific quality of the sensation that the absence of food produces in a body that is not eaten for many hours. It is not a neutral signal, a simple indicator that the fuel gauge is low. It has an emotional valence, a mild but real urgency, a quality of incompleteness, a pull toward resolution that is more insistent than most bodily sensations. This quality is not an accident of design. It is the evolved motivational force of a system that needed to ensure that the people who carried it would not be indifferent to the absence of food, that they would be moved by something stronger than intellectual awareness to do the work of finding the next meal. The hunger that feels urgent is the hunger that got the species out of camp and into the landscape in search of what was needed. The urgency is the memory of why it mattered. There is a broader category of what might be called cultural memory around food, the accumulated wisdom of generations of people who lived close to the reality of scarcity and encoded their understanding of that reality in the food practices and food beliefs that were passed forward through the culture. The grandmother who cannot bear to waste food, the cultural tradition of cleaning your plate, the preserved and fermented foods that every traditional cuisine contains, the kimchi and the sauerkraut and the preserved lemons and the saltfish and the dried meat, all of them representing the accumulated technological wisdom of communities that understood from direct experience that the abundance of today needed to be extended into the scarcity of tomorrow. These practices are sometimes dismissed as the anxieties of an older generation that no longer apply in a world of plenty, but they are in fact the living residue of a very long and very practical education in the management of food under conditions of uncertainty, an education that the age of plenty has made unnecessary to repeat, but has not entirely erased from the cultural memory. The food memories of childhood occupy a particular place in the body's larger memory of eating, not the cellular memory of the species, but the personal memory of the individual, laid down in the early years when the associations between food and safety and belonging and love were first being formed. The food that a mother made, the particular smell of a grandparent's kitchen, the dish that appeared at every holiday gathering year after year until its flavor became inseparable from the feeling of the occasion itself. These memories are encoded with an emotional depth and a sensory precision that most other childhood memories do not match, because food was present at every significant gathering, because the body's response to eating is so direct and so physical, because the association between nourishment and the people who provided it is one of the earliest and most fundamental of human emotional connections. The food memories of childhood are among the most durable of all human memories, and they carry into adult life a residue of feeling that the rational mind often cannot fully account for. The anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss observed that food is not only good to eat, it is good to think, by which he meant that the categories and distinctions that different cultures draw around food, what is edible and what is not, what is cooked and what is raw, what may be eaten together and what must be kept separate, what is food for the feast and what is food for the fast, reflect the deeper categorical structures through which those cultures organize their understanding of the world. Food, in this sense, is a language, a system of signs and meanings through which communities communicate their values and their cosmologies and their social arrangements in a medium that everyone participates in every day. The body's memory of what food means is therefore not only a biological memory, but a cultural one. The accumulated significance that generations of eating together in particular ways, on particular occasions, with particular foods, has deposited in the shared life of the community. What is perhaps most remarkable about the body's memory of food is its persistence in the face of the radical transformation of the food environment that the last century has produced. The cellular preferences for sweetness and fat and salt that were written into the body across hundreds of thousands of years of ancestral evolution have not been revised by a century of abundance. The emotional associations between food and safety and belonging that were formed in childhood remain operative in adult life, regardless of how thoroughly the adult's rational understanding of nutrition has developed. The cultural food memories encoded in traditional cuisine and food ritual persist in communities that have adopted the modern food system in almost every other respect. The body remembers what it was built to remember, with a fidelity and a persistence that the transformed world around it has not diminished. The memory is older than the transformation. The memory will outlast it. This persistence is, in its way, a form of loyalty. The body's faithfulness to the long history that produced it, its refusal to simply update its ancient programming in response to the changed conditions of the present. It is also, in the context of the modern food environment, sometimes a source of difficulty. The mismatch between the ancient preferences and the contemporary availability, producing the tensions that the age of plenty has made visible. But beneath the difficulty, the loyalty is something to recognize and even to honor. The body that still responds to sweetness with pleasure is the body that survived the lean seasons, when sweet meant ripe, and ripe meant calories, and calories meant survival. The body that still stores fat efficiently is the body that carried the species through the dry months and the failed harvests and the long nights between meals. These are not failures. They are the marks of a very long and very successful survival story, written in the language of appetite and metabolism and the quiet, persistent cellular memory of everything the species has been through to arrive at exactly this moment. Warm, fed, at rest, in the dark. Let that memory be present with you now, not as a thought to analyze, but as a quality of the night. The deep bodily sense of being held by something older and larger than the individual life. The cellular knowledge of a long survival story that continues in you tonight, as it has continued in every generation before you. You carry in you the memory of the hunter who walked out into the uncertain morning and returned with enough. The memory of the farmer who watched the sky and planted anyway and gathered what the season offered. The memory of the child who learned in the body that the lean season always turned. The memory of every shared meal and every feast after scarcity, and every night when the fire burned low and the body managed the dark on its own resources and arrived at the morning still capable, still searching, still alive. That memory is in you. It is you, in one of the deepest senses the word allows. Sleep inside it tonight. Every culture that has ever developed a pattern of daily eating has eventually arrived, by one route or another, at the same conclusion, that the last meal of the day is different from the others, not just in its position in the sequence, not just in the practical fact of its timing, but in its quality, its social weight, its emotional register. The morning meal is the meal of beginning, quick, functional, the body being provisioned for the demands of the day ahead. The midday meal, where it exists, is the meal of the middle, a pause in the day's work, a brief return to the body's needs before the afternoon's labor resumes. But the evening meal is the meal of completion, the gathering at the end of the day, the moment when the day's effort is behind and the night's rest is ahead, and the act of eating carries with it the particular quality of a conclusion. The last meal of the day is where the day comes home to itself.
In the hunter-gatherer world, the evening meal was not always guaranteed, but when it existed at the fire. The fire that had been the center of the group's social world through the evening hours was also the hearth at which the day's food was prepared and shared. The timing of the meal was not determined by a clock, but by the return of the light, the narrowing of the day toward the horizon, the cooling of the air, the gathering of the group back to the central warmth after the dispersal of the day's foraging and hunting. The evening meal in this world was the day's accounting, the moment when the group reassembled and what had been found was distributed and consumed, when the day's success or failure in the eternal project of feeding the community was assessed in the most direct possible way. What had come in was what there was, and the group ate it together in the firelit dark.
As human societies developed more complex domestic arrangements, the evening meal accumulated social significance that went far beyond its practical function. In ancient Rome, the cena, the main meal of the day, eaten in the late afternoon or early evening, was the social centerpiece of Roman domestic life, the occasion around which the relationships of the household were organized and expressed. The Roman paterfamilias, who presided over the cena, was not simply managing the distribution of food. He was performing the role of household head, the person responsible for the welfare of everyone under his roof in the most direct and daily of possible ways. The cena was where clients came to confirm their relationship with their patron, where family members gathered to renew their bonds, where the social hierarchy of the Roman household was enacted in the language of who was present and who was served what and in what order. In medieval European domestic life, the evening meal of the household was similarly charged with social meaning. The timing of the evening meal varied by season and social class, the nobility eating late and elaborately, the laboring classes eating earlier and more simply. But the gathering of the household for the day's final meal was a consistent feature of domestic life across the social spectrum. In the peasant household, the evening meal was often the only time in the day when the family was fully assembled. The children back from the fields, the adults finished with their labor, the fire built up for warmth and cooking. What was eaten was often simple: bread, pottage, whatever the kitchen garden and the common land and the day's labor had produced. But the gathering itself was the point, the household reconstituted at the end of the day around the table that was also the hearth. The foods that different cultures have associated with the evening meal reflect the particular logic of the meal that ends the day. In many traditions, the evening meal is the warmest meal, the cooked meal, the meal that involves the most preparation, the meal that draws on the full range of what the household's resources can produce. This makes practical sense. The morning meal needs to be quick. The midday meal may be eaten away from home, but the evening meal has the full attention of the household and the full warmth of the fire. But it also reflects something about the emotional logic of the evening meal, the sense that this is the meal that deserves the most care, that the end of the day calls for something more complete and more nourishing than the provisional meals that came before it. In Japan, the evening meal has long been organized around the concept of ichiyu sansai, one soup and three sides, a balance of flavors and textures and nutritional elements around a bowl of rice that is the center of the meal. The simplicity of the framework belies the care that goes into its execution, each element chosen to complement the others, the whole meal a small, carefully composed statement about what good food and good balance look like. The Japanese evening meal, in its traditional form, is not elaborate in the Western sense. It does not aspire to the abundance of the Roman cena or the medieval feast. It aspires to something quieter and in some ways more demanding, the achievement of completeness in restraint, the satisfaction that comes from a meal that is exactly what it needs to be and nothing more.
In the cultures of the Middle East and the Mediterranean, the evening meal has historically been the occasion for the most extended social eating of the day, the long, unhurried meal that moves through multiple courses and multiple conversations, that regards the act of eating as inseparable from the act of talking and being together. The Lebanese meze, the Turkish sofra, the Spanish sobremesa, the period of conversation that continues at the table after the meal is technically finished, all reflect a cultural understanding of the evening meal as something that belongs to the whole evening, not just the duration of the eating. The table is not cleared when the food is gone. The gathering continues, because the gathering was always as much the point as the food.
For the body, the evening meal carries a particular physiological significance that its position at the end of the day creates. It is the meal after which the body will not eat again for the longest gap in the daily cycle, the overnight fast that the sleeping body will spend drawing on the reserves provided by the day's eating. The quality and quantity of the evening meal therefore matters in a specific way. It is the body's last provisioning before the long metabolic night, the meal that sets up the overnight repair and restoration that sleep makes possible. Every traditional dietary system that has paid careful attention to the timing of eating has understood this intuitively. The evening meal should be sufficient but not excessive, warm and digestible, timed early enough that the work of digestion is well underway before sleep begins. The body that goes to sleep on a well-timed, well-chosen evening meal is a body that can sink into the deeper levels of restoration that the night provides. The rituals that surround the evening meal across cultures, the setting of the table, the lighting of candles, the prayer or the moment of acknowledgement before eating begins, the particular foods that signal that this is the evening meal and not any other, are the accumulated wisdom of communities that understood, however they expressed it, that the last meal of the day deserves a frame, that the transition from the day's activity into the evening's rest is a threshold worth marking, and that the meal at that threshold is the natural occasion for the marking. The candle lit at the evening table is not simply a light source, it is the signal that the day is done and the gathering has begun. The domestic equivalent of the ancient fire around which the hunter-gatherer group reassembled at the end of the day's dispersal, the hearth that called the people back to themselves and to each other after the long effort of the day. The last meal of the day has been eaten. Whatever it was, simple or elaborate, solitary or shared, eaten at a table or on a couch, prepared with care or assembled quickly from what was available, it has done what the last meal of the day has always done. It has closed the day's accounting. It has provisioned the body for the night's long work. It has, in whatever form the evening allowed, enacted the ancient logic of the shared meal or the private meal, the fire rebuilt or the stove turned off, the day gathered up and set aside. And now the body is doing what it does after the last meal, settling, digesting, beginning the slow metabolic transition that will carry it through the dark hours into the morning. The last meal of the day is behind you. The night's long fast has begun, and the body, faithful and ancient and extraordinarily competent at exactly this, is taking it from here. Let it. The day is done. The meal is finished. The fire is low. Rest now, the way the species has always rested at the end of the day's eating, completely, and with the quiet confidence of a body that knows how to carry itself through the dark. We have arrived, together, at the end of a very long story. Not the end of the story itself. The story of the human relationship with food has no end, continues forward into every meal that will be eaten tomorrow and the day after. into every harvest season and every hungry morning, and every shared table, and every fire built against the dark, in whatever forms those things take in the lives of the people who come after us. But we have arrived at the end of what we set out to do tonight, which was to walk slowly and carefully through the question of what hunger really was, to look at it from many directions, to let its answers come at the pace that the late hour invites. We have done that. The story has been told. And now it is time for the body that has been listening to do what the body has always done at the end of the day's last story, to let the words dissolve into the quieter frequency of sleep, and to trust the ancient program to carry everything from here. What we have traced together across these 20 chapters is the story of a body that was built not for comfort, but for endurance, not for the certainty of the modern kitchen, but for the uncertainty of the open plain, not for the guaranteed meal, but for the gap between meals, the metabolic wisdom that carries a person through the empty hours, the hormonal intelligence that manages the transition from glucose to fat, the cellular memory of every lean season that the species has navigated and emerged from on the other side. This body, your body, is the product of an unbroken chain of survival that extends back further than any story can reach. Every single person in that chain was hungry at some point. Every single one of them came through it. You are the continuation of a 200,000-year winning streak in the most fundamental competition that the natural world has ever run. Think about what that means, held quietly in the mind as the night deepens around you. The chain that produced you did not break. Not in the lean seasons of the African Pleistocene, when the rain did not come and the herds moved and the group had to walk further and eat less and trust the body to manage what the landscape withheld. Not in the agricultural centuries, when the harvest failed and the granary emptied and communities survived on less than they needed for months at a time. Not in the famines that punctuate the historical record, the desperate passages through which the ancestors of every living person somehow found their way. Not in any of the 10,000 ordinary difficult days between the great catastrophes, the days when the hunt returned with nothing, or the garden produced less than expected, or the meal was smaller than it should have been, and the body managed it anyway, the way it always managed it, without drama, without collapse, with the quiet metabolic competence of a system that had been doing this for longer than the mind can hold. The hunter who walked out across the ancient savanna before dawn, running on the overnight fast, the body sharp and alert in the cool morning air, that person's line did not end. The farmer who planted through the dry season and watched the sky and gathered what the season offered and rationed the stores through the lean months, that person's line did not end. The child who learned in the body what hunger was and what the body could endure, and how the season always, eventually turned, that child grew into the adult who fed the next generation of children, and that generation fed the next, and the line kept going, unbroken, through every difficulty the world placed in its path, all the way forward through the millennia to the particular human being lying in the dark tonight, listening to a story about where that body came from and what it has been through to get here. The body you inhabit tonight is not a fragile thing. It presents itself as fragile sometimes, in the small anxieties of the hungry hour, in the discomfort of the missed meal, in the modern tendency to treat any gap in the feeding schedule as a minor emergency to be immediately resolved. But underneath those surface responses, the deep architecture is something else entirely. It is the architecture of a system built for precisely the conditions that have felt, at various points in this story, most threatening. The uncertain hunt, the empty granary, the long lean season, The nights when the fire burned low and there was nothing left to eat, and the body had to carry the person through on its own resources. The body was built for all of that. It has survived all of that. It is, in the most literal sense, descended from the survivors of all of that. Its endurance is not a hope, it is a demonstrated fact, proven across a span of time that makes every human civilization seem like a recent footnote.
There is a particular quality to the body at rest in the late hours that deserves a moment of direct attention before we arrive at the end of this story. It is the quality of a system that has completed the day's work and is now engaged in the work that only stillness allows. The repair of tissue, the consolidation of memory, the restoration of the hormonal balance that the day's activity has displaced. The slow, careful work of a metabolism running on its reserves, drawing down the stored energy with the precision of a system that has been doing this every night for as long as the species has existed. This is not inactivity. This is the body's most private and most essential work, the maintenance that keeps the system running, night after night, across the full length of a human life. What the body does in the dark, while the mind is absent, is as important as anything the mind directs in the light, perhaps more important. The body in sleep is not resting from its work. It is doing a different kind of work, the kind that the busy, fed, active day does not allow. The hunger that this story has been about, the hunger that shaped the human body across 200,000 years of uncertain eating, is not an enemy. It never was. It was and remains a signal from a system that knows what it needs and knows how to ask for it. It was the motivator that sent the hunters out across the plain in the cool morning. It was the guide that directed the gatherers toward the plants that would provide what the body required. It was the regulator that modulated appetite through the lean season, preventing the overconsumption of scarce resources and extending the reserves that the body needed to reach the next abundance. It was the teacher that instructed every generation of children in the body's capacity for endurance and the season's capacity for turning. Hunger was not the problem that the human story was organized around solving. Hunger was the intelligence at the center of the body's relationship with the world, the signal that kept the species connected to the reality of what it needed and honest about the effort required to obtain it.
The story of what food has meant to the human species is in the end a love story. Not the romantic kind, though food is present at the center of romance in every culture. A deeper kind, the love between a living system and the world that sustains it. The relationship between a body and the nutrients it requires to continue. The bond between the species and the landscapes that fed it through the long centuries of its becoming. The savanna that offered fruit and game and water. The river valleys that received the annual flood and gave back grain in quantities sufficient to build cities. The forests of Southeast Asia that produced the spices that the ancient world crossed oceans to obtain. The soil that received the seed and returned, with the cooperation of the rain and the sun, the harvest that stood between the community and hunger. The body's relationship with food is its most fundamental relationship with the world, the daily confirmation that the world is, still, providing what is needed, that the exchange is ongoing, that the ancient agreement between the living creature and the living earth has not been broken.
You have been arriving at the edges of consciousness throughout these 20 chapters, and sleep is very close now. The body knows. It has been receiving, through all these hours,
the quiet permission that the late hour and the slow narration have been extending, the permission to release the day, to let the thoughts lose their edges, to allow the boundary between waking and sleep to become permeable, and then to cross it with effort or intention. This is the oldest transition in the human daily cycle. The moment when the day's consciousness yields to the night's unconsciousness, when the body takes over from the mind, when the ancient program assumes full management of the system, and the complicated, effortful business of being awake gives way to the simpler, deeper, more restorative business of being asleep. You have been arriving at this moment since the first words of this story. You are here now.
The body that made it through the uncertain hunt and the lean season and the failed harvest and the long fast and the slow centuries of the agricultural world and the disorienting abundance of the modern one, is the body that is resting now, in the dark, in the quiet, carrying you through the last hours of this particular night, toward the morning that has always, without exception, eventually arrived. It has done this every night of your life. It will do it tonight. It does not need your help or your attention or your direction. It needs only what the ancient body has always needed at the end of the last meal of the last waking hour, the simple gift of your willingness to stop and be still and let the night do what the night has always done. The story is complete. The fire is low. The body is ready. Sleep now, the deep, unhurried sleep of a species that has earned its rest across the full length of its extraordinary history, all the way back to the first fire and the first shared meal and the first dark that the first people trusted the body to carry them through. It carried them. It will carry you. It always has. Sleep well, David. The body knows the way.